On the night of July 14th, 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. In doing so, he not only helped create a legend, but also ensured that his legacy would be forever intertwined with that of the notorious outlaw. And let's be honest, it ain't that great of a legacy. Many consider Garrett to be a coward at best, a no-good backstabbing Old West Judas who betrayed his best friend for a handful of silver. What's more, Pat is also labeled as a liar and an egomaniac, a glory seeker who would turn on his own mother if that meant earning a little dough and building his own reputation. And over 26 years after he gunned down the kid, Pat himself would be shot and killed under similar circumstances. A murder that to this day remains unsolved. Who killed Pat Garrett? How accurate is the narrative surrounding the former sheriff of Lincoln County? Is all of this hate deserved? And who the hell was Garrett anyway? What was his life like before he met Billy the Kid? And what became of Pat in the decades following that fateful night at Fort Sumner? You may think you know who Pat Garrett is, but I guarantee you've never heard his story told quite like this. We're going to do quite a bit of fact-checking in this series and hopefully dispel a few myths. We're also going to look into some new information showing that the infamous Billy the Kid may have possibly not been of this world. Oh yeah, we're going intergalactic on this bad boy. My name's Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett was born on June 5th, 1850 in Chambers County, Alabama. He wouldn't stay there for long, though, as his father, John Lumpkin Garrett, a farmer by trade, would move the family to Claiborne Parish, Louisiana in 1853. John purchased a large plantation just outside the town of Antioch, and it's there that Pat would do most of his growing up. And boy, oh boy, did he grow. In a day and age where the average American male was just 5 foot 5 inches tall, Garrett dwarfed his peers at a whopping 6 foot 4 inches. At least he did by the time he reached early adulthood. A future business partner would remember Pat as the tallest, most long-legged specimen I ever saw. Now, what role young Pat played on the family farm is unknown. The Garretts did have slaves, at least 34 according to one census. I imagine they did the bulk of the heavy lifting around the plantation, but Pat would later allude to doing the usual chores of plowing, hoeing, and even a little clerking. He also spent a considerable amount of time out in the woods with his pawpaw's old rifle, hunting small game and otherwise becoming a proficient marksman, as country boys and girls tend to do. Garrett did receive an education, and despite what you may have heard, he was far from illiterate, although how much schooling he truly attended is anyone's guess. Same goes for church. Story goes that Pat began questioning organized religion fairly early in life, leading many to suspect that he was of an atheistic or agnostic bent. And I will discuss this more later on in the series. Now, the Garrett plantation covered 1,800 acres, and one record shows that at least on one occasion, the family delivered a load of 65 mule-drawn wagons to the market, each loaded to the brim with produce and cotton. 65! So needless to say, the family was doing well. The prosperous times would not last forever, though. And when disaster struck, it seemed to do so in waves. Although Pat's daddy John was exempt from serving during the Civil War, the conflict would ultimately wreak havoc on the plantation. Obviously, the Garretts would lose their large force of slave labor. Hard to feel sorry for them on that account. And when U.S. troops occupied Louisiana, they reportedly confiscated a good portion of the Garrett cotton, causing the family to quickly go broke. Pat's mother Elizabeth died in March 1867 at the young age of 38, and John, already in poor health and deeply in debt, sank into the bottle and followed his wife to the grave in February of the following year. So in short succession, Pat and his siblings lost their family property, i.e. their wealth, and both of their parents. And Pat, by the time of his father's death, was still a few months shy of his 18th birthday. What remained of John Garrett's estate was fought over, with Pat's no-good brother-in-law, guy with the insanely ridiculous name of Larkin Lay, coming out on top. Pat didn't much appreciate the way Larkin was handling business, but it's not exactly clear if this was justified. On one hand, Lay did begin selling off all the Garrett family possessions. On the other hand, Pat's daddy left the family $30,000 in the hole, and someone had to handle all those debtors who came calling. Nevertheless, Pat threatened to kill Larkin, and not just because of his goofy name, but legend has it that out of love for his sister Margaret, he refrained. So instead of committing murder, a still teenage Garrett simply left Louisiana for the Lone Star State, sometime in January of 1869. The next few years are a bit murky. By Pat's own admission, he first took up work on a farm in Dallas County for a couple of years before signing on with a cattle outfit. How many herds he helped drive up north to Kansas is not known, but Pat would spend around 2 or 3 years on the hurricane deck of a cow pony before moving on. Stuart Lake, in his book Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal, claims that Garrett and a few other Texas cowpokes once attempted to tree Dodge City, forcing Wyatt and Doc Holliday to arrest him. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. I'm also not sure how Wyatt would have known who Pat was back in those days, but as we'll soon discuss, it is verified that Pat did indeed spend at least a little time in Dodge. We just don't know if he did so as a cowboy or a little later on. Sometime in the mid-1870s, Garrett and his buddy, a guy by the name of Luther Duke, partnered up on their own cotton/corn farm, but it would be a short-lived venture. Guess it proved to be way more work and far less money than they had hoped, so the pair turned instead to the lucrative hide business. They threw in with the tough Civil War veteran Skelton Glenn and a young Irishman Joe Briscoe and set out for West Texas in search of bison. Now their first stop was Fort Griffin, 50 miles to the northeast of present-day Abilene, Texas, where they picked up a couple of hired hands, a skinner by the name of Nick Buck and a camp cook who called himself Grundy Burns. And aside from Cookie, that's about as Old West of a cook name as you can imagine, Grundy. I don't know that I'd eat anything cooked by somebody named Grundy, but who knows? I'm sure his biscuits were excellent. They also picked up some brand new hardware there at Fort Griffin, tools of the trade. Skelton and Duke both chose the powerful Sharps rifles, with Pat opting instead for a much lighter Winchester. And after stocking up on necessary provisions, the team lit out for Buffalo Country, ultimately setting up camp near the Double Mountains, about 100 miles to the west of the fort. And they got to killing buffalo. How many, I do not know. According to Leon Metz in his book Pat Garrett, The Story of a Western Lawman, a good hunter could take down anywhere from 60 to 100 of the shaggy beast per day. Of course, there wasn't no point in shooting more than your skinners could clean, and it's said that a good knife man could only handle around 60 to 75 per day. I can't imagine that was very fun work. I also imagine you'd be smelling pretty ripe after skinning out 60 plus buffalo. Not like there was a whole hell of a lot of places for these boys to take a bath. Now, if you're not familiar with the methods used to hunt buffalo back in those days, it's my understanding that they'd locate the bison, post up far enough away so as not to spook the herd, and then commence shooting. Apparently, if a buffalo is dropped with a well-placed shot, what a cousin of mine refers to as the smackdown, the others won't stampede off. They'll simply continue grazing or even plod on over to see why their fallen comrade decided to take a nap. So long as Garrett and the others didn't scare the herd, they could pretty much just sit in one spot and kill one after another after another. So much so that they would need to stop every now and then just to either cool down the barrels of their rifles or switch out guns entirely. And it's pretty much in this fashion that the great herds were nearly wiped out. It's estimated that in the year 1830, there were around 40 million American bison roaming the Great Plains. By 1870, just 5.5 million, and by the time Pat Garrett and his pals were done, the population had dwindled to just around 400,000. And of course, by the turn of the century, there were only 300 left in the entire country. Thankfully, the population has since rebounded, and at present, there are around 350,000. You know, I'm not sure if these buffalo hunters really fathomed what they were doing. I don't think they were out there laughing like maniacs, high-fiving each other for their part in driving the buffalo to extinction. I don't know that they believed that was even possible. I also don't know that the vast majority of them had ulterior motives, like starving out the Native Americans or anything like that. I think they were just purely in it for the money and not giving too much of a thought as to what the future held. And it showed. I mean, they'd only take the hide along with the tongue and a few other choice cuts of meat, leaving the rest just to rot. Now, those fresh skins, also known as green hides, were taken back to camp, stretched and pegged to the ground, and once they were dry, they were piled up in various stacks, depending on grade and quality. Sometimes the buyers would come to you, and sometimes you just had to load everything up in your wagon and make the long trip back to civilization. Garrett and the boys could get around $2 per hide, with prices scaled down accordingly based on size and quality, of course. So just some quick math. Not my strong suit, but let's say Pat was killing 65 buffalo a day. That comes out to $2 times 65 is $130, right? Which back then was like the rough equivalent to $3,500 bucks. Even if he split that 50-50 with the Skinner, which I doubt he did, that's still a very good payday. That said, it's not like they were out there killing bison every single day. I imagine they went through quite a few dry spells, during which they had nothing better to do but sit around and irritate each other. You know how it goes. Whenever us men are forced to be around one another for day on end as we suffer through the monotony of labor and boredom and a shortage of female companionship, nerves can get a little raw around the edges, and we can definitely start pushing each other's buttons, as was the case in November of 1876. The buffalo seemed to peter out and the weather turned gloomy. Skelton Glenn had left for a nearby way station, Wrath City, in order to have a gun repaired, and the remaining men in camp were in a foul mood. Grundy Burns, the cook, had spent the better part of several hours attempting to get a fire started with wet buffalo chips while Joe Briscoe was trying, and failing, to do laundry in a freezing cold rain puddle. As he approached the smoldering fire, he held his hands out for warmth and grumbled, mostly to himself, about how hard it was to keep anything clean out there on the plains. Garrett, who was also stepping close to the fire, decides to smart off and say that nobody but a damn Irishman would be dumb enough to try to wash anything, and Garrett also stepping close to the fire, decides to get smart and say that nobody but a damn Irishman would be dumb enough to try to wash anything in that muddy water. And, well, this sets Briscoe off. Counts vary, what else is new, right? But apparently Briscoe began mouthing off right back to Pat, saying, "Yes, and you damn Americans think you are damn smart and know a damn sight," which prompted Pat to reach on over and pop Joe in the mouth, knocking him on his ass. Joe gets up and rushes at Garrett, only to be swatted away. He rushes again, and once more Garrett knocks him down. This process is repeated a couple more times before Briscoe goes for an axe and begins chasing Pat around the cook wagon. Eventually, Garrett gets tired of running, picks up his Winchester, and blasts a hole in Joe, sending him falling back into that tiny little buffalo shit fire. Everyone rushes in to help pull him out, but there wasn't no patching up Joe's wound. Now take this next part with a grain of salt, but allegedly, Joe then called Pat over to him and asked him, Pat Garrett, the man who just shot him, for forgiveness. Pat said that yes, he forgave him, and Joe expired around 20 minutes later. Per sources, Pat then saddles a horse and takes off alone onto the prairie, greatly distressed at what had just transpired. He returns the following morning, looking ragged as hell, to find that Skelton Glenn has also returned, and the two men discuss the unfortunate chain of events. Glenn then suggests that Pat ride on over to Fort Griffin and surrender to the authorities. He does so, but returns a few days later saying that the officials had declined to press charges. Is this true? I got no idea. I'm not aware of anyone ever locating any sort of documents from Fort Griffin proving or disproving as much, nor do I necessarily know that there would have been any such proof, even if Pat did attempt to turn himself in. We've discussed this ad nauseum here on the Wild West Extravaganza. People got off scot-free from killings all the damn time back in those days, especially in Texas. So yeah, I think there is a good chance that Garrett turned himself in, and I think there's as good of a chance that the authorities at the fort told him that they had bigger things to worry about and just to get on back to hunting buffalo. Now this is probably as good a time as any to discuss the sources used when examining our topic du jour, Pat Garrett. I feel like it's important to point out that not all of the info we have about Pat just comes from his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. I think this is important, mostly due to how many people consider Garrett to be a very unreliable source. And don't worry, we will be touching on his bad reputation later on in this series. That said, the story of Briscoe's death and much of what we know about Pat's time as a buffalo hunter comes straight from his partner, Skelton Glenn. Now obviously, Glenn wasn't there when Pat shot Joe, but he would have certainly heard the details from the others. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that many years later, Skelton would develop a very strong dislike towards Garrett. As such, his account of Pat's life should also be taken with a grain of salt. Everybody, and I mean everybody, has some form of bias and some type of an agenda. That's just human nature, I guess. The trick when it comes to history, as far as I can tell, is taking all of the available information, letters, interviews, eyewitness accounts, court documents, along with the autobiographies, and then try to piece the evidence all together. It's not always the easiest task, but until someone invents time travel, that's the best we can do. We can't wholly discount questionable sources, like The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, or the words of Skelton Glenn. but we should also not be afraid to cast a somewhat skeptical eye on their musings as well. Now, as far as the authentic life of Billy the Kid goes, as you're likely aware, Pat did employ Ash Upson as a ghostwriter. It's pretty much agreed upon by historians that the first 15 chapters of the book, written in a very melodramatic style, are purely the work of Upson, while the other chapters, less flowery and written in the first person, likely come from Garrett himself. And these chapters are considered to be much more factually accurate than those that Upson wrote. Like I said, though, to dismiss this book entirely would be a huge disservice to history. Now, I personally used a few different sources for this series. One I've already mentioned, Pat Garrett, The Story of a Western Lawman by Leon Metz, which is said to be the definitive Garrett biography. Another book I found extremely valuable was Mark Lee Gardner's To Hell on a Fast Horse. Both Metz and Gardner are great writers, very serious when it comes to accuracy, and both works have an extensive collection of notes, along with bibliographies. And the same goes for Robert Utley's Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, which I also found myself returning to. So if you're interested in learning more or really diving deep into the source material, discovering why historians believe what they do about certain events, definitely check out these books. Links to all of them in the show notes. All right, let's get back to the story. Shortly after the killing of Briscoe, Pat and the others fell prey to several aggressions from the hostiles upon whose land they were trespassing. In early February of 1877, the Comanche struck Garrett's camp and destroyed 800 hides, along with making off with a few ponies. None of the hunters were unfortunate enough to have been in camp at the time, but you better believe they were looking to even up the score. Skelton Glenn raised a force of some 40-odd hunters who happened to be in the area, and they all rode out to teach the offending Comanche a lesson. Sans Pat Garrett. Why didn't Pat go with them? Well, he thought it was a stupid idea. Said it was simply a raiding party and that it was far too late to do anything about the damage. And it turns out he was correct. This punitive expedition, which was somewhat fueled by whiskey, turned out to be a failure, and after a brief battle with the Comanche, they returned with 1 man wounded and 0 horses retrieved. A similar raid occurred in May, this one with the white captive Herman Lehman as a participant. Matter of fact, Herman even had his horse shot out from underneath him by Skelton Glenn. In return, Glenn himself received either a bullet or an arrow to the leg, not sure which one, as he and another hide hunter by the name of Doughlin took refuge from behind a knoll and watched as their buffalo hides were burned or otherwise hacked apart. Once more, Garrett was not in camp when this occurred. When he heard what happened from a passerby, he lit out for the safety of Fort Griffin, where he and Skelton Glenn and the others were reunited. They returned to their pillaged camp with a couple of wagons and retrieved what few intact hides they could find and sold them off for just enough money to purchase some round-trip tickets to St. Louis. And once in the big city, Garrett quickly gambled away his remaining money as he and the boys decided on a change of careers. By the way, Garrett did love to gamble, and that's really an understatement. This was a pretty major vice and something that would dog him for the entirety of his life. All right, now, although I just covered Pat's time as a buffalo hunter rather quickly, the events described did take place from early 1876 until the spring of 1878, so a little over 2 years. And they weren't constantly out there in the middle of nowhere harvesting buffalo. In the off-seasons, or in the summer when the hides weren't no good anyways, it's said that Garrett and his partners would hang out not only in St. Louis, but also places like Dodge City. This could be how the story of him and Wyatt Earp coming face to face came into being. Also, Pat would later state that he met Bat Masterson in Dodge during one such break. As I alluded to earlier, Pat and Skelton Glenn's friendship would sour in the years to come. And this friction may be at least part of the reason why Pat is considered so untrustworthy. It seems that Skelton never got over losing all them hides to the Comanche. In the 1890s, he'd go so far as to file an Indian depredation claim of nearly $15,000 against the U.S. government, asserting that the warriors had violated a peace treaty by ransacking his camp. Glenn asked Pat to take the stand and testify on his behalf, which he did in the year 1899, over 2 decades after the attacks in question. And, well, Garrett's testimony didn't help Glenn's cause. To the contrary, it actually hurt his case quite a bit. According to Pat, the total value of hides destroyed was nowhere near the $15,000 he was asking for, but rather less than $1,000. Now, why Pat didn't play ball, I'm not sure. Seems like there must be something else going on here. Previously, I mentioned that the 800 hides were destroyed in just one raid. That alone comes out to more than $1,000. So I guess the question is, who's telling the truth? If Garrett was lying about the extent of damages, why? And if Garrett was telling the truth at the detriment of his old friend's wallet, also why? Were there truly 800 hides destroyed, or was that a number that Glenn just made up? Unfortunately, I do not have any answers for you. This debacle would drag on for years and years, even after Garrett's death. In 1912, once Pat was in the dirt, Glenn really ramped up the shit-talking about his former partner. I assume this was done to discredit Pat's claims about the hides and thus solidify his own case. Glenn testified that Garrett was a drunk, that he disappeared from the scene after the death of Briscoe, that he and the others were afraid that the lanky lawman would murder them in their sleep, and he even claimed that Pat wasn't really his business partner at all. And apparently, like I said, all of this was just to show that Pat's testimony wasn't worth a damn. What's more, Skelton found others to back his slander up. People who had, interestingly enough, previously testified that Pat's reputation was beyond reproach now changed their tune, accusing him of everything from not paying his debts to being an atheist, or in their words, an infidel. Which, as it turns out, was true, on both accounts. We'll get to that later. In the end, Skelton Glenn was awarded $4,150 in damages. And once again, while his memoir on Pat's time as a buffalo hunter is an excellent source, hell, the only source, really, when it comes to that time period, certain things should be taken for what they are. The writings of a man who had a deep grudge against the feller he was writing about. Someone who was dead and in the ground and not able to defend himself. That was all years to come, though. In the meantime, Pat, Skelton, and Nick Buck were all still buddy-buddy, and for whatever reason, they decided to call it quits on the buffalo hide business, abandon their wagons, and head west for the land of enchantment, finally arriving at Fort Sumner, New Mexico in the spring of 1878. I've spoken about Sumner many times in the past, so feel free to check out the episode I did on the first battle of Adobe Walls, as well as the series on Billy the Kid. Links in the show notes. TLDR, Sumner was established in 1862 to protect settlers from hostile natives who did not invite the settlers there in the first place. This was also where the Bosque Redondo was located, a so-called reservation where several thousand Navajo and Mescalero Apache were forced to live in squalor until 1868, when the Navajo were allowed to return home. The fort, which was a legitimate military installation, was abandoned in '69 and purchased by former fur trapper turned cattleman Lucian Maxwell, who moved his family there along with a few other Hispanic and Native American families. They planted crops, started running cattle and sheep, dammed the Pecos River for irrigation, turned the army barracks into real living quarters, and hell, by the time Garrett and his buddies arrived at Fort Sumner, the community boasted of a store, a dance hall, and even a couple of saloons. Not sure how many people lived there in 1878, but by 1881, Fort Sumner boasted a population of 285 souls. Just for a little perspective, the town of Lincoln to the south had a population of 638 that same year. Lucian passed away in 1875, so at the time of Pat's arrival, it was his oldest son, Pete Maxwell, who had the run of the place. Now, Pat and company were pretty near broke when they reached the fort, and hungry to boot. The boys spent their last $1.50 on some bacon and flour and settled down on the banks of the Pecos for breakfast, after which Garrett sauntered on over and secured them work for Pete Maxwell punching cattle. Now, Pete initially claimed that he did not need any help, likely on account of Pat's appearance. According to Fort Sumner resident Paco Anea, Pat looked like a quote-unquote tramp, and Lincoln County regulator George Coe would later remember that Pat and his friends were the hardest set of men I believe I ever saw. But Garrett did eventually win Maxwell over, saying that he could ride anything with hair and rope better than any man you've got here. And just like that, Pat was hired. Be that as it may, Skelton Glenn and Ross would not stay there at Fort Sumner for very long. They soon bid Pat adieu and headed back to Texas. Garrett, however, found himself enamored with New Mexico, especially the ladies who took to calling him Juan Largo on account of his tall frame. Pat became a regular fixture at the various balls and dances put on at Sumner and the surrounding communities, made friends easily, and by all accounts, he was wholly accepted by the locals. According to Paulita Maxwell, Pat was, quote, an easygoing, agreeable man, a good storyteller and full of dry humor. He was fond of a social glass and was a great hand to play poker and Monte, end quote. No word on whether Garrett ever courted Paulita, but he would soon set his sights on another local Spanish beauty by the name of Juanita Martinez. Or was it Juanita Gutierrez? No marriage certificate has yet been located, and there does seem to be some debate as to the young lady's actual last name. Some think she was the sister of Pat's second wife, Apolinaria Gutierrez, but both Paulita Maxwell and Paco Anaya claim that Juanita's maiden name was indeed Martinez. This is further backed up by at least one of Garrett's children. And according to Paco in his book I Buried Billy, Pat and Juanita tied the knot there at Fort Sumner in November of 1879. Interestingly enough, a young bandit known as Billy Bonney attended the wedding, as did several of his associates, guys like Charlie Bowdry and Tom Folliard. Quick side note, speaking of old Tom, turns out that I, and many others, have been all wrong when it comes to Folliard's last name. I referred to him as Tom O'Folliard, O with an apostrophe, kind of like a Irish name O'Reilly or O'Sullivan or O'Connor, in the series I did on Billy the Kid. And that's how I've always referred to Tom, and the way I've seen his name in nearly every single history book I've ever picked up. Turns out the O was just his middle initial. Census records do prove that Tom's actual surname was simply Folliard. According to Mark Lee Gardner, the O'Folliard last name doesn't even exist. So sorry about that, Tom. Now, sadly, Pat's marriage to Juanita would be very short-lived. Accounts vary, because of course they do, but it appears Juanita may have collapsed very shortly after the wedding ceremony, like that very night, followed by her possibly passing away the next day. Like I said, this just depends on which version you read. Others say that Juanita would linger for weeks, and historian Leon Metz theorizes that Juanita possibly died from a miscarriage. Even Pat's son Jarvis, when interviewed years later, didn't know very many details, only that his daddy was married before marrying his mother. Now, I did a little bit more digging, and it looks like as recently as September of 2021, Juanita finally got a headstone at the cemetery there at Fort Sumner. Her original burial location is unknown, but this new marker isn't far from where Billy and his pals are resting. FYI, in case you're like me and you've heard or read speculations that Pat was somehow involved in Juanita's death, there is no evidence or proof so much as hinting to such a thing. At least none that I could find. If you know something to the contrary, if you've got a legitimate source, please don't hesitate to let me know. Josh at wildwestextra.com. Turns out there's quite a bit of misinformation concerning the life of Pat Garrett. Imagine that. Like the rumor that he fled to New Mexico after abandoning a wife and kids in Texas, or that he killed somebody in Louisiana. There's no proof of any of that. Hopefully gonna bust a few more myths and long-held misconceptions during this series. The ones I just mentioned aren't that big, but there's a couple that we'll get to later on that I think really color people's views of certain historical events. And these are things that are just blatantly not true. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, in our timeline, it's still 1878, and Pat Garrett, not yet 29 years of age, is a widower. But I reckon life goes on, right? Even if his employment for Pete Maxwell didn't. Much like his first marriage, this job for Pete would be a relatively short affair. The two had some sort of falling out, resulting in Garrett calling it quits and trying his hand at several different business ventures. Allegedly. I should point out that there's not a lot of hard evidence for these various careers either. But in no particular order, the story goes that Pat opened up a butcher shop, but it went out of business after he was caught slaughtering stolen cattle. He possibly started his own restaurant or eating establishment, as is hinted at in Young Guns 2. He's said to have raised hogs for a bit, partnered in a grocery business, and eventually he went in with Beaver Smith in his Fort Sumner saloon. According to a friend, Pat was a, quote, working devil. He'd work at anything, end quote. And yeah, while staying there at Fort Sumner, Pat Garrett absolutely got to know the notorious BTK, or as you may know him, Billy the Kid. Per Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Garrett and the Kid were not good friends at Fort Sumner, but they were not enemies either. They saw each other frequently enough, and they had a healthy respect for each other, certainly each other's ability to take care of himself. Garrett was usually serious, and the Kid usually boisterous, and they each had a reputation as a better-than-average shot with a 6-gun, end quote. Now, I do feel the need to offer up a bit of clarification when it comes to this friendship between Pat and Billy, one that's somewhat in contradiction to what Mr. Gardner wrote, as well as in contradiction to what I, myself, have personally said. I wrote a lengthy addition to the Wild West newsletter recently about this topic. You can give it a read by heading on over to wildwestjosh.substack.com or going to wildwestextra.com, hitting the newsletter icon up top. But long story short, I have in the past stated pretty boldly that Billy and Pat were not friends. Not really. And even though I add that disclaimer of not really to the statement, I do regret putting it in such a way, as I now feel like I was kind of being misleading. So let me state for the record that yes, I, Josh, the host of the Wild West Extravaganza, do believe that Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid were friends. However, I also believe that this friendship is somewhat blown out of proportion, and if Pat and Billy were alive today, their relationship status on Facebook would be set to "it's complicated." So here's what we know. When Pat first arrived at Fort Sumner, Billy was busy down in Lincoln County attempting to avenge the death of his employer, John Tunstall, little something known as the Lincoln County War. Maybe you've heard of it. And following the Battle of Lincoln, the Kid and what was left of the regulators would take to spending time at the old fort, as well as Roswell and Las Vegas and even Texas. But yeah, Billy did seem to have a special place in his heart for Fort Sumner. And when there, he spent a considerable amount of time either at Hargrove Saloon or over at Beaver's Joint, where Pat worked. Remember, Billy didn't drink, but he did love to gamble, as did Garrett. There's no denying that Billy and Pat knew and spent time with each other. But were they truly friends? Well, in the eyes of Paulita Maxwell, they certainly were. And damn good friends at that. Paulita stated that Pat was as close a friend to Billy had in Fort Sumner, and that if Garrett was low on cash, he borrowed from Billy and vice versa. If Billy was broke, he borrowed from Pat. Furthermore, Paulita said that the pair were known as the long and short of it, and thick as two peas in a pod. They played cards together, would go to dances together, and even engage in friendly shooting competitions. So there you have it. That's from somebody who knew both men very well. That said, once again, I'll refer to that newsletter I wrote as I go way more into detail than I'm going to right now. I do think that this friendship gives the false impression that Billy and Pat, at the very least, rode together. So let me just state this very clearly in case there's any confusion. First of all, Pat Garrett was never involved in the Lincoln County War. Like, not at all. And that's not Josh's opinion. That's just fact. There's also no documentable evidence showing that Garrett and the Kid ever committed crimes together. While I don't doubt that Pat may have stolen a cow or two, hell, who didn't back in those days, he was not a member of Billy's inner circle of stock thieves. He wasn't part of the Kid's quote-unquote gang, nor was Pat Garrett a Lincoln County regulator. Matter of fact, Pat also had other friends that were on the opposing side of the Lincoln County War. Furthermore, contrary to popular belief, Pat was not elected sheriff with the idea that it takes a thief to catch a thief. When Garrett pinned on that badge, he was a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen. This was not a Henry Hill from Goodfellas situation where Pat was going to be prosecuted if he didn't turn on the Kid. A lot of the movies and other works of fiction will have you believe that Pat and Billy were outlaw buddies whose bond was forged in blood and hardship. In truth, there is no proof of that whatsoever. I do believe they were friends, but I don't think they were BFFs. And their relationship seems to have existed completely within the confines of Fort Sumner. They palled around together, they gambled together, they might have even gone whoring together, and they had many a shooting competition. But that's about it. I think the reason so many historians downplay this friendship is just due to everybody else blowing it way out of proportion. I don't think that's a very good reason, though. I'm by no means a historian, and I do offer up my own opinions, probably more than I should. But I also shouldn't let those opinions change the way that I report on historical events. So yeah, Pat and Billy were friends, but that friendship was not as deep as portrayed in certain movies, especially Young Guns 2. Hope I explained that adequately. Now, interestingly enough, Pat and Billy seemed to be neck and neck as far as marksmanship was concerned. According to Paulita Maxwell, Billy was a better shot than Pat. Others, however, considered Garrett to be the more accurate shootist. Pat would later say of Billy that he was no better than the majority of men who were constantly handling and using six-shooters. He shot well, though, and he shot well under all circumstances, whether in danger or not. And that last bit, I think, says it all. Not only about Billy the Kid, but all the other so-called gunfighters. I think history has proved that it's the man who can keep his head who wins the fight. You can practice your quick draw in a mirror all day long, but when bullets start flying towards you, when your target starts shooting back, that's when shit gets real. That's the true test. And it's a test that both Garrett and the Kid passed with flying colors time and time again. A little over 2 months following the death of Juanita Martinez, and 3 days after Billy gunned down Joe Grant there at Fort Sumner, Pat got married for a second time. The 29-year-old Garrett and teenaged Apolinaria Gutierrez swapped vows to Anton Chico in mid-January 1880. It was also around this time that Pat really cemented that deadly reputation of his. Some Comanche had stolen a small herd of horses from over near Roswell, and Pat led the posse that went in pursuit. Once the hostiles became aware that they were being followed, they killed off half of the stolen ponies, just in an effort to lighten their loads and travel even faster. The posse, upon finding the dead horses and realizing that they didn't have near enough food or water to keep on chasing these lords of the southern plains, ended up turning back for home. All except for Pat and a few of the toughest hombres. They kept on the hunt. And a week later they returned, looking mean as hell and carrying a large sack of moccasins, and leading a string of recovered horses. Now this story comes from Leon Metz in his biography of Garrett, and Mr. Metz lists as a reference an interview conducted in the November 27, 1949 edition of the El Paso Times. I tried and failed to locate said interview, so I'm not aware of any other particulars. If this is true, though, I think it's safe to say that at least a few of those Comanche warriors did not make it back to their lady loves. As you can imagine, this impressed quite a few folks. Not only was Pat a giant of a man physically, but he had now proved his sand and shown a little grit. And as it turns out, grit was exactly what a few prominent New Mexicans were looking for. Namely, the cattle king himself, John Chisholm, and the so-called father of Roswell and former Missouri bushwhacker, Captain Joseph Leah. Both men were more than tired of the rampant thievery and chaos caused by the Lincoln County War and its aftermath, especially when it was negatively impacting their bottom line. What's more, they realized the potential of New Mexico. If they and other well-to-do men of means hoped to lure investors to the territory, and for the territory to one day become a state, they'd have to establish a little bit of law and order. And while Billy the Kid certainly wasn't the only outlaw who was out there stealing with both hands, by 1880 he had become the most well-known. And it was Billy who they soon set their sights on. Now at that time, the sheriff of Lincoln County was George Kimball. And although he and the Kid had their differences, Sheriff Kimball wasn't exactly all that gung-ho about apprehending him. Hell, him and Billy were even known to play cards together on occasion. As such, Leah and Chisholm and other powerful and influential New Mexicans decided they'd try to recruit somebody who was not only popular enough to run against Sheriff Kimball in the upcoming election, but someone tough enough to take out their biggest perceived thorn in the side, William H. Bonney. And that someone was our very own Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, a.k.a. Juan Largo. And hell, why not? Like I said, Pat was liked by everybody. At least he was before he ran for sheriff. He had shown that he had nerve, he could fight, he could ride, and perhaps best of all, he knew Billy the Kid personally. And yeah, when Garrett was approached, he was more than receptive to the idea of running for sheriff. If they had to pull his leg, if he hesitated at making this decision, I'm not aware of it. Now this alone is enough for some to just outright dismiss Garrett as a backstabbing son of a bitch. But is this sentiment justified? I don't know. Once again, how close were he and Billy, really? And does it even really matter? You know, on one hand, I got a lot of friends who, although we're not exactly besties, I also wouldn't go snitch on them, much less pin on a badge and try to arrest them myself. Then again, these same friends aren't wanted for murder, and they're also not out there stealing from damn near everybody. And devil's advocate, this would be a big step up for Garrett. This was a guy who was raising pigs and slaughtering buffalo and herding cattle not all that long ago. To go from that to being a respected and elected public official, especially the sheriff of a county as massive as Lincoln County was, this could be a serious life-altering career decision. And unlike Billy Bonney, Pat had a wife to consider. He was thinking about the future. Now, I'm not so much trying to defend Garrett's decision here as I'm trying to understand it. Was he just really that big of a law and order guy? And if he was, where's the fault in that? And once again, I don't know that I would do something similar. For what, a paycheck, a steady job, a legacy? I'm just thinking out loud here. All right, fact of the matter is, Garrett would accept this challenge. He and his new bride, Apolinaria, moved to Roswell as Fort Sumner was not part of Lincoln County, and in no time flat, other powerful and influential men got behind his campaign, and even Billy Bonney's old nemesis, Jimmy Dolan. Now, I can't say for certain how Billy must have felt when he heard the news, but it's safe to say that he wasn't all that excited about Pat running for sheriff. Hell, the Kid actually campaigned for the incumbent, George Kimball. As for Paulita Maxwell, she remembers being shocked at the news, saying that Pat's only qualification was his friendship with Billy, and that what he was doing, while not against the law, went against the code of the frontier, turning on a friend. What's more, Paulita asserted that Billy knew exactly what this meant, that Garrett's one job was to kill or arrest him, and from that point on, it was a war to the death between the two of them. So much for friendship, huh? And when it came election time in November of 1880, Pat claimed a resounding victory, receiving nearly twice as many votes as Kimball. Now, Pat was elected on November 2nd, 1880, but his term wouldn't officially begin until January of 1881. However, Kimball did deputize Pat and then just step aside, allowing Garrett to run the show. On paper, he was just a deputy and would remain as such for the next 2 months. In reality, he was, in all but name, the new, real sheriff of Lincoln County, and you better believe he hit the ground running. Not only was Pat now the sheriff, but he was also given a deputy U.S. Marshal commission, allowing him to pursue the kid outside of the county, in places like Fort Sumner or even across the border into Texas. And it wasn't long before this job took on a renewed sense of urgency. Just a few weeks after the sheriff's election, Billy and them others got into that fight up there at White Oaks, resulting in the death of Jimmy Carlisle. An action that would be a tipping point as far as the kid's reputation was concerned. I spoke more about this in the series on Billy the Kid, but Carlisle was very well liked, and although it remains unclear as to who was truly responsible for his untimely demise, Billy would take the blame. As such, many who supported the kid during the Lincoln County War now began having a change of heart, thinking that maybe Barney was indeed the bad man that the papers were making him out to be. By the way, if this is your first time listening to the Wild West Extravaganza, as I alluded to just a moment ago, there is a 5-part series available on Billy the Kid, link in the show notes. So if it seems like I'm glossing over certain events, these are topics that were previously covered. I just didn't really see the need to repeat everything on this episode. By this point in our timeline, the fall of 1880, Billy had already struck that deal with Governor Lew Wallace that never came to fruition. The Lincoln County War, the kid testifying in court against Dolan and Colonel Dudley, the breakup of the regulators, all of that has already took place prior to Garrett being elected sheriff. And it would be just about a month and a half after the election when Wallace would place that $500 bounty on the kid's head. Hope I'm setting the scene properly. Pat Garrett was just elected the new sheriff of Lincoln County, and he had the backing of not only the area's most prominent businessmen and large ranchers over there in Texas, but the federal government as well. Billy the Kid and his friends had just taken part in the killing of Jimmy Carlisle and are being hunted on 3 fronts. Not only by his old associate Pat Garrett, but Frank Stewart and the Texas Cattlemen's Association, and that Secret Service agent, Azaria Wilde. And that is my long-winded damn way of saying that the heat was on. On November 20th, 1880, Garrett, along with his buddy Barney Mason, met with Agent Wilde to discuss their plan for raiding Fort Sumner. Now, Barney Mason I have briefly touched on in the past, but I think he's worth taking a closer look at. Born in Virginia sometime in the early 1850s, Mason spent time in Texas before migrating to New Mexico and working for Pete Maxwell. He even killed a man over in Fort Sumner in late 1879. The bizarre gunfight began when a drifter opened up fire on Mason, for seemingly no reason at all. The unarmed Barney initially fled but came back healed and plugged the drifter twice in the chest. Barney knew Billy the Kid and all his friends, and at one point he got along pretty good with them. Hell, gang member Billy Wilson even lived with Barney for a while. But when it came down to the nut cutting, for whatever reason, Mason turned on the Fort Smith desperados and went to work for Garrett. I say for whatever reason, but it does appear that Barney and Pat were pretty tight. When Garrett and Apollinaria got hitched up in Anton Chico, it was a double ceremony, with Mason and his bride tying the knot as well. Also, it looks like Barney was deathly afraid of Billy the Kid. Like I said, he was a kind of sort of hanger-oner of the boys there at Fort Sumner, but he also was maybe not as much of a tough little ass-kicker as he liked to pretend. Somewhere along the line, he and the kid got crossways even before Barney went to work for Garrett, and Paulita Maxwell shared a pretty funny story concerning the two. She would say, quote, Barney Mason, Pat Garrett's brother-in-law, lived in Fort Sumner for many years, and wanted people to think that he was much braver than he was. But despite his boastfulness and his pose as a bad man, Fort Sumner always took his courage with a few grains of salt. When Billy the Kid and his followers were at the height of their success, Barney pretended to be a great friend of theirs. He gave them information, warned them of danger, and could not do enough for them. But when Pat Garrett was made sheriff and the forces of law began to close in on the kid, Barney had a change of heart. He accepted a deputyship under his brother-in-law and became as great an enemy of the kid as he formerly had been a friend. This embittered the kid, and he sent word to Barney that he was going to kill him on sight. Secretly, the kid's threat scared Barney half to death, but he put up a brave show. "The kid can't scare me," he boasted. "I'll teach him a thing or two if we ever meet." But every time the kid rode in, Barney rode out. He never got within a mile of the kid if he could help it. One day when Barney was driving to town from Santa Rosa with his wife beside him on a wagon seat, he saw the kid coming toward him on horseback along the road. The situation looked ticklish for Barney. The country was open range and not a tree or rock to hide behind, and a desperado who had sworn to kill him about to pass within a few feet and face to face. In this crisis, Barney did some quick thinking. While the kid was still far off, Barney jerked the black mantilla off his wife and draped it about his own shoulders, and clapped her sunbonnet on his own head. Then he snuggled down into the seat, made himself look as small as possible, and clucked up his horses into a brisk trot. With his face concealed beneath the sunbonnet, he drove past the kid and was greatly relieved when he arrived at Fort Sumner to find himself still alive. Then he went strutting about town, telling how he had met the kid on the road and had opened up fire on him, and the kid had taken to his heels and had been lucky to escape behind a hill. "I told you what I'd do to that feller if we ever met," boasted Barney. And along toward evening, the kid came jogging into Fort Sumner. And as usual, the panic-stricken Barney got on his horse and ran away and hid himself in the hills. Everybody, of course, wanted to hear from the kid all about his narrow escape from death at Barney Mason's hands. When the kid heard the story Barney had been telling, he bent double with laughter. "I recognized him the moment I saw him. His mantilla and sunbonnet didn't fool me. I would have killed him if his wife hadn't been with him. I didn't want to drop him over dead in his wife's arm." End quote. Now, when Pat was first elected sheriff, he did have Mason continue mingling with the criminal element over there at Fort Sumner in hopes of gathering intel, which is what he was doing leading up to that big raid. As for Pat, he organized a posse over in Roswell, which included Bob Ollinger, and Frank Stewart and his Texas boys were also brought in. The idea was to make a big sweep of the Fort Sumner area and arrest Billy and as many of his friends as they could locate. Ideally, this would include counterfeiters and stock thieves, a big win-win for all involved. Late in the evening of November 29th, Garrett, Ollinger, and around 20 others rode out of Roswell and straight to Dan Diedrich's ranch. Unfortunately, none of the men they were looking for were present, but they did flush out a couple of guys who had recently escaped jail over in Las Vegas, one of which was the notorious J.J. Webb. These two prisoners in tow, the posse pushed on to Fort Sumner with similar results. No Billy the Kid. And it's there at Sumner where Garrett received a letter informing him of the recent killing over in White Oaks. He was also told by a little birdie that Charlie Bowdry, Tom Folliard, and Tom Pickett were hiding out nearby at the Yarby Ranch. Seeing as how Pat had a federal warrant for Bowdry, the posse headed out once more. On the way to the Yarbys, they spotted a lone horseman who turned out to be Tom Folliard. Upon spying the posse, the bandit spurred his horse into action and took off riding like the devil, firing his Winchester behind him while doing so. Although Garrett and the others attempted to give chase, and even though they were able to put a bullet in Tom's horse, he still got away. Of course, by this point, the element of surprise was gone. By the time Garrett and the posse reached Yarby's ranch, nobody remained but Charlie Bowdry's wife, and she wasn't saying peep. The next stop was Los Portales, sort of an oasis rock formation that the kid would sometimes stop at while trailing stolen livestock. Garrett and his men found a couple of head of stolen cattle, a pile of blankets, and some old musty flour in one of the caves, but no outlaws. From there, they pushed on to the Wilcox Brazil Ranch, another known hangout of Billy and Company, and owners Thomas Wilcox and Manuel Brazil were just two of the locals that were becoming mighty weary of wanted criminals using their property as a hideout. The posse would have lunch there at the ranch, and Wilcox told Pat that Charlie Bowdry was ready to make a deal. In turn, Garrett passed a message to Charlie, asking to meet up the next day just outside of Fort Sumner, adding that Bowdry should come unarmed. Well, he didn't. Charlie showed up with a loaded pistol on his hip like the dangerous man he was, and he and Pat exchanged some not-so-nice words. Finally, they came to an agreement. If Bowdry would stop riding with the kid and basically cut him and the others off, there would be an air quotes effort to get him released on bail, after which he could work to redeem himself. Bowdry somewhat agreed, saying that he would sever his relationship with Billy, but should he or the others stop by his place, he would likely have no other recourse but to feed him a meal and let him rest. Pat left Charlie with a warning. I told him if he did not quit them or surrender, he would be pretty sure to get captured or killed. As we were after the gang, it would sleep on their trail until we took them in, dead or alive. That part about sleeping on the trail wasn't necessarily true. Garrett's men had been riding hard for over a week. Every single one of them was in need of a warm bed, and even their horses needed to rest. That being the case, Pat ended up disbanding the posse and sending everyone back to Roswell except for Barney Mason, who accompanied the sheriff to Las Vegas with those 2 prisoners they captured over at Diedrich's place. On the way there, Pat received word from an advance rider that a posse from Vegas had ridden out to retrieve the prisoners, and that they'd be waiting in the village of Puerto de Luna. Okay, fine. Great news for Pat and Barney. It was nearly 80 miles from Puerto de Luna to Vegas, so this would save Garrett a considerable amount of travel if he could just offload the prisoners and then return back to the task at hand. Problem is, this so-called posse wasn't exactly the most competent bunch of buckaroos who ever set a saddle. They rode out to meet Pat and Barney just a few miles outside of the village, some 20-odd strong and resembling what Garrett would later describe as a, quote, whirlwind of lunatics. They were a haughty bunch, huffing and puffing about what big badasses they were and prancing their ponies around the prisoners who were getting more and more nervous by the second. J.J. Webb, himself a former lawman and acutely aware of the fact that he was about to be lynched, offered Pat $10 if he'd stay with him until they reached Vegas. Garrett agreed, but refused the money. Once in Puerto de Luna, Pat had the prisoners fitted with irons as he swung by Padre Polacco's store for a chat. Polacco, real name Alexander Grzechowski, was a former priest who had been friendly with the kid. At least he had been until Billy stole several of his horses. I guess Pat had the idea to maybe question the Padre, but was soon interrupted by a pair of local toughs. First up to bat was Juan Mays, who approached Garrett with his hands up, sarcastically mocking the sheriff by saying, "Here I am, take me." To Garrett's credit, he dismissed the fool and returned his conversation with the Padre. That's when Marino Leyva decided to try his luck, stepping up and letting Pat know that he couldn't take him, to which Garrett replied that he didn't want him. Leyva wouldn't let it go, though. Kept on running his mouth until Pat shoved him to the ground and told him to get the hell gone. Marino did indeed leave, but he came back a few minutes later with a pistol in his hand, letting loose a couple of ineffectual shots before Garrett was able to clear leather and put a slug through the would-be gunfighter's shoulder. Next thing you know, here comes what passed for the law there in Puerto de Luna, telling Pat that he needed to hand over his weapons and that he was under arrest, prompting Barney Mason to ask Pat if he wanted him to, quote, cut the son of a bitch in two. Pat urged calm, but refused to either hand over his guns or allow himself to be taken into custody. The next morning, he simply settled the matter with the local justice of the peace before joining the posse on the road to Las Vegas. Now, once they arrived at their destination and the prisoners were turned over to the proper authorities, Garrett met up with Frank Stewart and his Texas gunmen to go over their options. Pat was pretty sure that in his absence, Billy Bonney had moved back to Fort Sumner, so they all decided to head back down that way and see what they could stir up. That being the case, early in the morning of December 18th, before the sun even cracked the horizon, Garrett, Barney Mason, and Frank Stewart, along with 10 of his cowhands, all came slinking in to Fort Sumner on the sly. They had just spent around 15 hours in the saddle and were tuckered out, so they got themselves a room and settled down, just figuring on keeping a low profile and hopefully getting some rest as they waited for the kid to show up. Turns out nap time would have to wait, though, as they soon got word that Billy was hiding out in a nearby abandoned building. The posse gathered, quiet as a bunch of church mice, as Pat gave the order not to take any chances and to shoot to kill. With that, he raised his leg and hammered the door open with one swift kick of the boot. Fortunately for the innocent man inside, Garrett and the others held their fire long enough to realize that he was not Billy the Kid. Poor bastard was just a mailman from over in Vegas who now needed a fresh pair of underwear. With that bit of excitement out of the way, the posse returned to their quarters, and the day passed without incident. Following morning, Pat began working a few of the locals. First up was Juan Gallegos, the teenage stepson of Thomas Wilcox, who let it slip that Billy and his pals were currently hiding out at the Wilcox Brazil Ranch, much to the chagrin of Seniors Wilcox and Brazil. Next, Pat found Billy's sympathizer Jose Valdez and forced him to pen a letter stating that Garrett and the posse left Fort Sumner and that the coast was clear. Garrett then wrote a separate note to Wilcox in Brazil before giving both notes to young Gallegos. And Juan did as he was told, delivering both letters, and believe it or not, Billy and the boys took the bait hook, line, and sinker. Now by this point, Probably for her own safety, Charlie Bowdry's wife was living inside the old Indian hospital portion of Fort Sumner. Figuring that's where the kidding gang would stop first, Pat placed a guard as he and the others waited patiently inside, along with a few Hispanic residents who Pat suspected would sound alarm. Sure enough, that evening, around 8 p.m., here comes posseman Law and Chambers passing the word that horsemen were approaching. Men in their positions, the lawmen waited as the Kid, Billy Wilson, Tom Pickett, Dave Rudaball, Charlie Bowdry, and Tom Folliard approached, with Folliard in the lead. Just when the time was right, Pat called out for him to halt, and Folliard, always game, went for his sidearm. All hell then broke loose as the posse opened up fire and the outlaws wheeled their horses and galloped away to safety. All except for one, at least. Tom Folliard's horse remained, him slumped over the saddle and crying in agony. Garrett would later recall, quote, "You never heard a man scream the way that he did." Tom pleaded with the posse, saying that he was killed and to stop shooting, prompting Barney Mason to use that line that Viggo Mortensen borrowed in Young Guns 2. "Take your medicine, boy." The outlaw was taken inside and laid on a blanket, where he would linger in pain for the next 45 minutes, altering between cursing Pat, asking for Garrett to finish him off, and panicking and begging not to be shot again. Finally, Tom asked for water, which was given to him. He drank, laid back, shuddered, and died. A couple of days later, Manuel Brazil showed up at Sumner and reported that Billy and the others had just left his place, prompting Pat and the boys to saddle up. And Garrett knew exactly where the Kid was headed, a little tiny rock house at a place they called Stinking Springs, just a few miles away from the Brazil Ranch. Now, instead of repeating myself, I will once more refer you to the series on Billy the Kid, Episode 5, Q&S, if you're interested in hearing all the details as to what exactly occurred there at Stinking Springs. Long story short, Pat and his men surrounded the house, and at daybreak they shoot and kill Charlie Bowdry, thinking that he was the Kid. The remaining outlaws, Billy Bonney, Dave Rudaball, Billy Wilson, and Tom Pickett, eventually come out with their hands up. These prisoners are first transported to Fort Sumner, where they drop off Bowdry's body, and then head up to Puerto de Luna for Christmas dinner before finally arriving in Las Vegas late in the afternoon of December 26th. By the way, this all happened before Pat was officially the sheriff of Lincoln County. Remember, that didn't go into effect until January 1st, 1881. When he arrested the Kid, he was still just a deputy, at least on paper. Now, Billy and most of the others would only stay one night there in that Las Vegas jail. The next morning, Pat came to fetch his prisoners and load them onto a train bound for Santa Fe, but he soon ran into a few roadblocks. First of all, Tom Pickett would stay behind no matter what, as Garrett held no federal warrants on the man. Which, okay, fine. Only thing is, the jailers there at Vegas also didn't want to give up Rudaball, who had previously killed a guard while escaping. I guess the townsfolk wanted Dirty Dave tried and hung right there so they could watch. I'm sure Garrett sympathized, but he had also promised Rudaball that he would see him to Santa Fe without getting lynched, much in the same way that he had guaranteed the safety of Dave's old pal, J.J. Webb. So Garrett put it to the Las Vegas sheriff in no uncertain terms. "This is my prisoner, I'm responsible for him, and I intend to have him." Reluctantly, they did release Rudaball back into Pat's custody, but the lanky lawman wasn't out of the weeds yet. At the train depot, they had to push their way through an angry mob just to get on board. Once inside the passenger car, Pat cautioned the civilians, saying, "Any of you people don't want to be in on it had better be out before I lock the car, as we are liable to have one hell of a fight in a few minutes." One witness on the train who stayed behind reported, quote, "It seemed as if the fight would begin any minute, and I expected to see the Mexicans fire into the car right away." He's referring there to the mob, which was largely comprised of local Hispanics who had absolutely no love for Mr. Dave Rudaball. The witness continued, 9 men with cocked rifles sturdily standing off a mob of hundreds. Those men never flinched an iota. Such bravery, even to recklessness, was new to me." End quote. Some of the vigilantes even rushed the conductor and shoved a gun in his face, telling him that he was a dead man if he tried to pull the train forward. Finally, here comes the Las Vegas sheriff, heavily armed and demanding that Dave Rudaball be handed back over. I guess with that mob behind him, he was suddenly brave enough to stand up to Garrett. Still, though, Pat held firm, replying with a resolute, "Come and take him." Garrett then turned and told his prisoners that if bullets started flying, he'd arm them, a statement that further excited the already lively Billy the Kid, as he replied, "All right, Pat, all I want's a 6-shooter. There's no danger, though. Those fellers won't fight." And sure enough, Billy called it. After nearly an hour, a brave postal inspector of all people, who had once been a train engineer, offered to slip in and throttle the locomotive out of the mob's reach. And that's just what he did, lurching ahead as the wannabe vigilantes simply watched in open-mouthed astonishment. All the while with Billy Bonney hanging his head out of the window, waving his hat and hollering adios. That evening, they pulled into Santa Fe, handed the prisoners over to Deputy U.S. Marshal Conklin, and Garrett began the long process of trying to claim that reward that Governor Wallace had placed on Billy's head. Okay, so this is a little strange, and to be perfectly honest, I don't quite understand it. First of all, let me just say that this is around the same time that Wallace had published his book, Ben-Hur, so he wasn't even in the territory. That being the case, Garrett had to deal with the acting governor, a weasel by the name of William Rich, who informed him that he had no authority to make good on said reward. Apparently, this was due to a technicality, specifically the wording of the reward notice. Governor Wallace had issued it back in December of 1880, and it read as follows. I will pay $500 reward to any person or persons who will capture William Bonney, alias the Kid, and deliver him to any sheriff of New Mexico. Satisfactory proofs of identity will be required. Lew Wallace, Governor of New Mexico. So I guess the first issue is that it was written as if Wallace was personally offering the money, as opposed to the territory of New Mexico, which in my opinion is bullshit. The next problem is that Pat was still not technically sheriff. He delivered the Kid to that marshal in Santa Fe a whopping 3 or 4 days before his official term would begin. And remember, that wanted poster said that Billy had to be turned over to a sheriff, which is also bullshit. Now, the biggest question I have that still has not really been answered to my satisfaction was if Pat ever received this $500. I have reached out to several people who might be able to shed further light on this subject, including some experts in the field. As of this moment, though, it does not appear as if Garrett was awarded that initial bounty. Hey, real quick, I'm recording this after the fact, just a little bit of an update. I have heard back from more of those experts I just referenced. I don't really feel comfortable sharing their names because these were private emails, and it does still seem like there's a big question mark as to whether Pat received the money or not. Either that or I'm too dumb to understand it the way they're explaining it to me, which is always a possibility. I will say this, at least one of the people I've been talking to, whom I have a lot of respect for, someone who has researched and written extensively about both Pat and Billy, does seem pretty confident that yes, Garrett did receive that initial $500. I don't have any references I can point you to. I have no original sources. I can't say when he received this money, so it is still a little bit iffy, to me at least. And just to be clear, so there's no confusion, Pat Garrett would ultimately be paid a $500 reward after killing Billy the Kid. That absolutely did happen, despite what you may have heard, and we will be discussing that on next week's episode. The confusion here, on my part at least, is whether or not Pat also was given that first $500 bounty that was placed on Billy's head, that he should have got after that arrest there at Stinking Springs. Alright. Nevertheless, private citizens began pitching in money, and Pat ended up with way more than $500. His pockets full of dough, he then returned to Lincoln and busied himself with the usual mundane tasks of a county sheriff, doing paperwork, collecting taxes, serving writs, all that fun stuff. He also used some of that money to purchase both a ranch and a hotel, so he was doing okay financially. Billy would eventually be transferred to Mesilla, where he was put on trial and found guilty for the murder of the former Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady. And on April 21st, 1880, some 5 months after the arrest at Stinking Springs, he and Garrett were once more reunited. Judge Bristle, the same judge who had passed that guilty verdict, ordered that the Kid be transported back to Lincoln and placed in Garrett's care until May 13th, at which point he should be hung by the neck until he be dead. This posed a bit of a problem, as Garrett now had to figure out how to keep Billy from escaping a town that, according to the sheriff, never had a jail that could, quote, hold a cripple. Finally, Pat decided to house the Kid on the second floor of the Lincoln County Courthouse, formerly the Murphy Dolan store, in a room all by himself that also just happened to be directly next to Garrett's office. And while incarcerated, he would be guarded by deputies James W. Bell and Bob Pecos Ollinger. Now let's talk about old Bob Ollinger. Whereas I do think Pat Garrett has been somewhat falsely maligned over the years, it appears that Ollinger deserves all the hate that he still receives. He was the same age as Pat, originally from Indiana, which I think explains quite a bit, and spent time in both Kansas and Indian Territory before migrating down to the Seven Rivers area of New Mexico shortly before the Lincoln County War broke out. Bob was an active participant, and in October of 1880, he was one of the men who Agent Azaria Wilde commissioned as a deputy U.S. Marshal. Ollinger spent weeks with Pat hunting down the bandits, and in April of 81, Ollinger was one of the guys who went up to Mesilla to fetch the kid. This doesn't mean that Sheriff Garrett was fond of Bob. To quote Pat, Ollinger was a born murderer at heart, and I never slept out with him that I did not watch him. Of course, back then, we had to use for deputies such materials as we could get. Ollinger was a bully and considered by some as the meanest man in New Mexico. Others, in contrast, recognized him as a coward who hated those whom he couldn't bluff. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a classic case of what I've heard referred to as Little Dick Syndrome. Similar to Little Man Syndrome, but someone suffering from Little Dick Syndrome doesn't have a sense of inadequacy based on their height so much as the size of their you-know-what. Just a little word of the wise for all you fellers out there. Definitely got to keep an eye on how you're overcompensating. For instance, if someone were to make a movie about, I don't know, a girl who happens to be a Comanche warrior and she fights and defeats a predator, or, what else would be a crazy thing for somebody to make? If somebody made a movie about a pink doll and everything in the movie was pink and this somehow, really outraged you, you might not want to let people know because you just might be also letting them know that you've got a little wee-wee, right? Following me? Sometimes we tell on ourselves without knowing it. Anyway, you may recall me speaking briefly on the Jones family back in the series on Billy the Kid, whom Billy stayed with for a little while after returning to New Mexico from Arizona. Well, in August 1879, Ollinger gunned down John Jones, the son of high school and Ma'am Jones. And rumor has it, Jones was shot from behind. Not only that, but he was not the first man who Bob Ollinger killed under mysterious circumstances. So yeah, it's only natural that Ollinger would continue his bullying ways there at the courthouse, constantly taunting the kid and threatening him with that double-barreled shotgun. And it's not even just that, man. Ollinger was just cocky, to the point that he even refused to take proper precautions when guarding Billy, causing Sheriff Garrett to reprimand him. Bob responded by laughing and claiming that he could turn the kid loose and just herd him around like a goat, and that there was absolutely no way he could escape. Words that Ollinger wouldn't live long enough to regret. Now, it was the total opposite with Deputy Bell. Everybody seemed to like him, including Billy. And even though Deputy Bell was really good friends with Jimmy Carlisle, and thus had a legitimate reason to hate the kid, he didn't let it show. He treated him fairly. Of course, fair or not, that wasn't going to stop what was coming. Bell may have been nice and all, but the kid was a killer, and he wasn't going to let such a thing stop him from escaping. And I don't know that I blame him. I guess if it was between me and the hangman's noose, I'd be in a killing mood as well. And you better believe when the kid got his chance on April 28, 1881, he took it. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened, but while Bob was escorting the other prisoners across the street for dinner, the kid and Bell got into a scuffle. Billy got his hands on a pistole, and that was all she wrote for old Deputy Bell. Bob heard the commotion and came a-running, only to have the kid call out to him from the second-floor window of the courthouse. He looks up, and the last thing he sees is his own double-barreled shotgun in Billy's hands. The kid let loose with both barrels, and the alleged backshooter Bob Ollinger was dead before he hit the ground. And just like that, Billy the Kid was free yet again, with a couple more scalps on his belt. Now, Garrett was not in town when this occurred. Some say that he may have been purchasing the lumber to have Billy's gallows constructed, and others speculate he was doing his normal, more mundane job of collecting taxes. And to Pat's credit, he would mostly take responsibility, saying, quote, "I knew the desperate character of the man whom authorities would look for at my hands on the 13th of May, alluding to the kid's execution date, that he was daring and unscrupulous, and that he would sacrifice the lives of 100 men who stood between him and liberty. And now I realize how inadequate my precautions were." End of quote. Now, this taking of ownership wasn't wholly complete, as Garrett also let it be known that the orders he gave Bell and Ollinger were not properly carried out. Not that it mattered much. I mean, Garrett knew they were being slack, especially Bob, and he didn't relieve either man from duty, nor did he let their lack of discipline prevent him from leaving town. The responsibility ultimately fell on him, as it should have. Pat didn't arrive back in Lincoln until the day after the escape, but he quickly organized a volunteer posse to track the kid down, with 0 results. Next, he dispatched Barney Mason to see what he could find out. The deputy was able to track Billy all the way to Fort Sumner. I don't suppose it took no genius to figure out that's where he was headed, and with a tip from the locals, he soon found Billy in the company of a few Mexican sheep herders. Noticing that the kid was armed to the teeth and not looking all that friendly, Mason did what he had always done and put spurs to his mount and skinned on out. He did then attempt to raise a posse in nearby Fort Sumner, but couldn't find no takers, so he just went on back home. Man, poor old Pat Garrett just could not catch a break when it came to deputies. Now here's where things get interesting. Instead of raising another posse and going back to Fort Sumner, Pat simply bides his time. He stayed close to home, hung out with his wife and kids, and tended to his little ranch. Wasn't long before people started thinking that maybe Garrett didn't have what it took to put an end to the kid. Turns out this is exactly what Pat wanted. He would later say, "If my seeming unconcerned deceived the people and gave the kid confidence in his security, my end was accomplished." I do think it's worth mentioning that Pat didn't really think Billy would stick around Fort Sumner. Tom Folliard was dead, as was Charlie Baldry. Rudaball, Pickett, and Wilson were all rotting behind bars. There was absolutely nothing but air and opportunity between Billy and the Mexican border, or the Colorado border for that matter, where his old friends, the Coes, were living. It goes against all logic that the kid would stay in New Mexico. He had yet another $500 bounty placed on his head, and besides, it wasn't like he exactly had a home to call his own. I got a little pushback for once refuting the idea that Billy was too smart to be taken by someone like Pat Garrett, and I think people were misinterpreting what I was saying. I did not mean that the kid was stupid, far from it. Matter of fact, I do believe that Bonnie was of above average intelligence. He was no dummy. But to say that he was too smart for Garrett to catch him flies in the face of everything that we've just discussed. Events that we know for a fact happened. Pat was able to lure Billy back to Fort Sumner for the ambush that saw Folliard killed. He was then able to capture Billy over at Stinking Springs. And now, with everybody in the territory gunning for him, the kid was still hanging around Fort Sumner. Which, let's be honest, that's not exactly the smartest decision in the world. Doesn't mean that the kid was stupid, but even smart people do things that, in hindsight, are foolish. Lots of theories as to why Billy stuck around. The most plausible, in my opinion, is that he stayed for a girl. We know that he and Paulita Maxwell were romantically involved, and there's rumors that Billy was also having an affair with Charlie Baldry's widow, as well as rumors that he was messing around with Pat Garrett's sister-in-law, Celsa Gutierrez, along with another young lady named Abrana Garcia, whom some think may have given birth to Billy's child. Given just a bit more time, I think it's likely that the kid would have got gone, maybe finish whatever business he had around Fort Sumner, or marry whatever gal he had his eyes on, and then just leave for old Mexico. Hell, supposedly he and Rudaball had planned to go to Mexico even before the incident over at Stinking Springs. And I do think had Billy done so, he likely would have lived much longer. As it were, whether this was truly intended or not, the hesitation on the part of Garrett did give the kid a sense of false security. So did his own intelligence, I'm sure. Billy was able to get out of every single tight spot he had ever been in, whether it was gunfights or arrests or what have you. He always came out on top. So why would he think things would change now? Got to assume that he was supremely self-confident, and seeing as how he was still just 20 years of age, he, like most young men, likely had no awareness to his own mortality. Be that as it may, William H. Bonney was not a god. He was susceptible to both handcuffs and bullets, just like any other man, and Pat Garrett was soon headed that way, packing both. Now, the kid escaped jail back in late April, and Pat didn't make a move until late June or early July, when he got definite word of Billy's whereabouts. His first tip-off was a letter from an unidentified businessman there at Fort Sumner, saying that Billy had been sniffing around, and he got a second letter stating pretty much the same thing from Manuel Brazil. And then here comes John W. Poe with the same story. Poe, by the way, was Frank Stewart's replacement, working with them Texas Panhandle ranchers. Just like Garrett, Poe had spent time hunting buffalo and had already done a couple of stints as a deputy marshal and a sheriff's deputy over in the Lone Star State. He ran for sheriff of Wheeler County and lost, so he took a job for them ranchers. And now, working under Pat Garrett, Poe would be sworn in once more as a deputy, giving him legal authority in New Mexico. It was in that capacity that he had been in White Oaks when he received a word as to Billy's location. Figuring it was now or never, Pat set out with just 2 men. the aforementioned John W. Poe, and the 25-year-old Thomas Kip McKinney. Ever the tactician, Garrett did not initially tell McKinney that they were headed to Fort Sumner to capture Billy the Kid. Instead, he asked that the deputy accompany him to Arizona on a business trip. Pat knew that folks would ask where he and Kip were headed, and he wanted McKinney to honestly give a little false information. Better for the locals to think that he was headed to Arizona, so that way nobody would tip Billy off. And if they did ride up there to Fort Sumner and let the kid know that Pat was headed out of state, even better. He would just lower his guard even more. It wasn't until they were clear of Roswell that Garrett finally told McKinney the truth. By the way, this is part 3 in a series on Pat Garrett. If you have not already done so, you may want to give the previous 2 installments a listen. We talk all about Pat's origin story, his life before Billy the Kid, and he and the kid's relationship. Pat and the deputies departed on the night of July 11th, keeping off the main road and traveling mostly in the dark. The 3-man posse would make no pit stops at ranches or homesteads along the way. And by the time the sun was rising, they were laid up on the low hills outside of Fort Sumner, glassing the countryside. Not seeing anything out of the ordinary, they formulated a plan. Nobody at the fort knew John Poe, so they figured he could go in and fish for some intel. Garrett also gave Poe orders to travel to nearby Sunnyside and speak with a trusted postmaster, Milner Rudolph. The plan was for Poe to then meet back up with Garrett and McKinney that night a few miles north of the fort. And as soon as John trotted into Fort Sumner, it was all eyes on him. Kind of like in the movies where an outsider walks into a bar and the jukebox goes silent and everybody turns and looks. No sooner had he hitched his pony than he was approached by a small group of men inquiring as to his business. Calmly, Poe explained that he had been mining in White Oaks, but came up short-handed, so he was now headed back to Texas. Soon enough, the welcome party invited Poe into the cantina for a drink, and he obliged. This drink led to a meal, and for the next couple hours, Deputy Poe kind of lounged outside and attempted to nonchalantly fish for information. Problem was, every time he mentioned Billy, everybody got real quiet. Not just that, but they also became visibly nervous. Finally, Poe left for Sunnyside and gave Mr. Rudolph the letter of introduction from Pat. At first, Milner was polite, but he too became tight-lipped whenever the topic of conversation gravitated towards the whereabouts of Billy Bonney. It was clear that the postmaster was scared of the kid, and he didn't want anybody thinking that he was snitching. Pretty soon, Poe just left and met back up with Garrett and McKinney in the preordained location. The trio took refuge in a bunch of willows till nightfall, before quietly heading inside the fort to see what they could find out for Pete Maxwell. Now here, if you don't mind, I will insert audio from the previous series on Billy the Kid.
Garrett and his 2 deputies crept in under the cover of darkness and positioned themselves among the peach trees to the north, with the old barracks building to their front and left and the Maxwell dwelling to their front and right. As they waited in the dark, voices speaking in Spanish suddenly shattered the silence. Crouching down, the deputies watched as a shadowy figure rose from the ground, quote, in his shirt sleeves, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, a dark vest, and pants. The mystery man spoke again, then jumped a nearby fence and walked into the compound. They would later learn that this was the kid, but at the time, Garrett didn't recognize him. Or at least he claimed not to recognize him. As always, theories abound. Some think Billy went in to see Paulita, others think maybe Celsa Gutierrez or any number of his friends. Apparently, at some point, Billy got hungry. He removed his hat, vest, and boots, and made his way over to Maxwell's with a butcher knife in one hand and his pistol in the other, cutting off a slab of meat from a fresh yearling. Meanwhile, Garrett, Poe, and McKinney had snuck their way around and also approached the Maxwell house. Garrett entered alone, hoping to speak with Pete as he left the other 2 deputies on the porch. Seconds later, Poe and McKinney both saw the kid, bareheaded and wearing socks, and looking as if he was fastening his pants. Likewise, Billy saw them and immediately raised his revolver. "¿Quién es?" Backing away quickly into a darkened doorway, the kid repeated this question twice more in earnest. "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it? Who is it?" John Poe then stands up and approaches Billy in an attempt to appear non-threatening, trying not to scare him, but the kid disappears into the shadows of the building. The same building that Pat Garrett's in. Meanwhile, Pat had woken Pete Maxwell up and was asking him about Billy's whereabouts. That's when they heard the kid backing into the room. "Pete, who them fellers outside?" Maxwell recognizes the kid's voice and sits up straight in the bed and declares, "That's him." At almost the exact moment, Billy sees Pat standing next to the bed. Remember, it's dark, so all the kid can make out is a large shadow. Nevertheless, he lifts up his pistol and once again lets out a startled, "Kines." According to Garrett, Billy then, quote, "went backward with a cat-like movement and I jerked my gun and I fired." The flash from the first shot temporarily blinded the sheriff, but he thumbed back the hammer and quickly fired a second time. Cocking the revolver for a third shot, Garrett heard a groan and held off. During all the chaos, Pete Maxwell jumped up and ran out of the room, almost getting shot by Poe and McKinney in the process. Pat follows Pete outside and tells his deputies that he thinks he just shot the kid, to which John Poe oddly remarks, "Pat, the kid would not have come to this place. You have shot the wrong man." This was around midnight, but folks were starting to gather. Pete Maxwell returned with a candle, holding it to the window where, according to Coe, we saw a man lying stretched upon his back dead in the middle of the room with a six-shooter laying at his right hand and a butcher knife at his left. Garrett and his deputies entered and upon further inspection verified that, yeah, Pat had indeed killed the infamous Billy the Kid. One of Garrett's two bullets had found its mark, entering Bonnie's left side of the chest just above the heart. Celsa Gutierrez ran at Pat tearfully, slamming her fist against his chest as Paulita and Delvinia Maxwell and a few other women stood nearby, crying softly. Armed and angry men began congregating, cursing Garrett and his deputies. All night the sheriff and his men stood guard, expecting an attack that never came.
The following day, Garrett ordered Alcalde Alejandro Seguro to hold an inquest on the killing. Seguro named 6 men to be on the so-called coroner's jury, including Pat's brother-in-law, Savel Gutierrez, and Pat's friend from Sunnyside, who we already mentioned, Milner Rudolph. In the words of Mark Lee Gardner, from his book To Hell on a Fast Horse, quote, "No inquest had been held at Fort Sumner for Billy's pals, Charlie Bowdry and Tom Folliard. But then again, there had been no reward for either of those men. With $500 at stake, Garrett was very particular that there would be a legal paper trail to document his success. He had gone through hell collecting the last reward from the territory, so he was determined to give Santa Fe bureaucrats as little doubt as possible." End quote. By the way, very nice guy, Mark Gardner. I've actually reached out to him a few times, looking for clarification on certain topics, and he's always been a big help. When I recommend his books, or any of the books I recommend here on the Wild West Extravaganza, I am not getting paid for it. Just so you know, those are not ad spots. Those are genuine recommendations. And as far as Mark Gardner goes, I am a fan. Now, full disclosure, if you buy one of Mark's books through the link in this episode's show notes, or via the books tab on my website, I do get a tiny percentage via affiliate sales from Amazon. But when I say tiny, I mean I have yet to even meet the minimum threshold to receive a payment. So we're talking fractions of pennies on the dollar. Anyway, Mark, on the off chance that you're listening, thank you, sir, for all that you do. Now, this coroner's jury examined Billy's body and then visited Pete Maxwell to hear his story. Their oddly worded finding reads as follows. "We of the jury unanimously find that William Bonney came to his death from a bullet wound in the left breast near the region of the heart fired by a pistol in the hand of Pat F. Garrett. And our judgment is that the action of said Garrett was justifiable homicide, and we are united in opinion that the gratitude of all of the community is due said Garrett for his action, and whom is worthy of being compensated." Now, I think it's clear that Garrett had a little part in that, right? Also, full disclosure, 2 of the men of this so-called jury were illiterate, so they likely had no idea what was even written in the document, at least not in the final form before they made their mark. This is used by many to question whether or not Pat really did kill Billy the Kid, but I personally think that the strange verbiage is more in line with Garrett just trying to make damn sure that he was going to get paid, a precaution that I think was more than justified. That afternoon, Billy was buried, as Job chapter 14 was read aloud. "Man that is born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not." And with that, Garrett dismissed his deputies and began a journey to Santa Fe, arriving on July 19th to find that the news of the kid's death had preceded him. And surprise, surprise, the powers that be once more balked at paying Garrett his reward money. Lew Wallace was no longer territorial governor, having been replaced by Lionel Sheldon, who, as luck would have it, was away in Washington, D.C. This meant that Garrett had to once more deal with William Rich, same dude that made it so hard on him to collect that money the first time after he arrested Billy. And just like before, Pat ended up all right. There was another collection, with everyone from John Chisholm to Jimmy Dolan pitching in, and when it was all said and done, Garrett had once more received far more money from private citizens than he was owed by the territorial government. That said, he did ultimately receive the $500 bounty. This is another common myth used to discredit Garrett. The idea being that the government of New Mexico refused to pony up the money on account of Pat not really killing Billy the Kid, or for at least not having sufficient proof. This is not the case. There was zero doubt that Garrett had killed Billy the Kid. It was not doubt as to the kid's death that caused the delay. It was just bureaucracy. I think they had to wait for Congress to meet again so they could approve that the money be taken out of some special account. You know how those stingy bastards like to hold everything up, as long as it's not their money. But yes, Pat Garrett was awarded the $500 bounty. That is not up for question. That is not debatable. This is proven. So don't ever let anybody tell you that he was not given that money. Now, Garrett did face accusations of cowardice for his actions there at Fort Sumner, but I'm not aware of anyone making such remarks to his face. But even to this day, there were many who accuse Pat of being a coward. I guess the reasoning here is that Billy was shot in the dark without a chance to defend himself, and some even claim that the kid was unarmed. All we can really go on is the words of the men who were there, right? There were only 3 people in the room when Billy was shot and killed, and one of them was dead. But still, both Garrett and Pete Maxwell claimed that Billy was armed. And so did John Poe and McKinney, who saw Billy right before he dipped inside Pete's house. The body was viewed by others afterwards, and it was stated that there was indeed a knife and a pistol on the ground near the kid's hands. But there is some discrepancy. Future governor of New Mexico, Miguel Otero, who also wrote the book The Real Billy the Kid, claimed that both Delvinia Maxwell and Jesus Silva had told him that when they saw the body, there was no pistol present. This was later contradicted by Jesus Silva himself in 1938, when he told a reporter that yes, there was a pistol and a butcher knife laying near Billy's body. Now, I don't remember if I touched on this in the previous series on the kid, but there was a question as to whether or not Billy got off a shot before Pat plugged him. Pete Maxwell, Coe, and McKinney all swore that they heard 3 shots, as opposed to just the 2 that Garrett fired. Due to this, Billy's pistol was examined, and although the hammer was resting on an empty shell, it did not appear to have recently been fired. Remember, it was somewhat common for people to keep the hammer on an empty chamber for safety reasons. Mark Gardner, for one, speculates that it's possible that when Delvinia Maxwell saw the body, there was no revolver laying nearby simply because Pat likely wouldn't have taken the time to place it back on the ground after he had looked at it. And I do think that is a very likely scenario. We can speculate all we want, but as far as credible sources go, Billy did have his pistol in his hand when Garrett shot him. Do we know that with certainty? Absolutely not. There were no cameras, and as far as I know, time travel has not yet been invented. But with the evidence at our disposal, using all of our powers of logic and reasoning, I do think it's a pretty good assumption that the kid did have a revolver. With that in mind, my question is, what the hell was Pat supposed to do? Let the kid shoot first? Garrett was also accused of hiding behind Pete Maxwell's bed or even under the bed. Pat denied this, but later said that had he known Billy was about to come in that door, he damn sure would have hidden somewhere. Garrett would later write, I started out on that expedition with the expectation of getting scared. I went out contemplating the probability of being shot at and the possibility of being hurt and perhaps killed, but not if any precaution on my part would prevent such a catastrophe. End quote. The idea that Pat should have challenged Billy to a duel at high noon or waited for Billy to fire first or whatever silly idea that people have about bravery truly baffles me. This was real life, not the movies. I don't know what people think Garrett should have done. He was standing in a room. He was surprised by the guy that he was hunting coming into the room in the pitch dark with a damn pistol in his hand. Somebody was going to die. Pat just happened to be a little bit quicker. And it really did occur just in a matter of seconds. Assuming the facts we have are correct and that Pat did not know that Billy was about to step into Pete Maxwell's room. It took him by surprise as much as anybody else. Billy hesitated to fire just a fraction of a second too long, and that was all it took. Vaya con Dios. Now, this is also about the same time that those rumors started coming out about Billy's body being mutilated, or that he was buried missing a finger, or that somebody had dug his corpse up and sold the cadaver. You can check out my recent episode titled Billy the Kid's Trigger Finger to learn more, but Pat would ultimately return and check on the grave and make sure it was unmolested. According to teller of tall tales and future Wild West Extravaganza topic, Charlie Siringo, Garrett even went so far as to have Billy's casket dug up and make doubly sure. Take that for what it's worth, though, as Siringo did like to make stuff up. Then there's the other rumors, like Garrett held Paulita Maxwell at gunpoint until the kid arrived, or that he caught Billy with Paulita mid-thrust and made up the story about Pete Maxwell's room to save her reputation. There is no basis in fact to any of these stories, and I assure you, this is no love of Pat Garrett that makes me say these things. There's just no evidence. If you have information to the contrary, please let me know, and I will let everybody else know. Josh@wildwestextra.com. Why didn't Garrett take a photo of a dead Billy the Kid? After all, this was standard procedure back in the Old West, right? Not really. We think it was common due to the dozen or so other photos of dead outlaws, which I'll admit are kind of cool, but the overwhelming majority of bandits were not photographed after they were killed. Hell, just think about how many of these guys that we don't even have a picture of them alive, much less dead. But Josh, Billy was the most famous outlaw of all time. They would have taken a picture of him. Once again, not really. Billy was somewhat notorious, sure, but he's way more famous now than he was in 1881. I think that's something we all got to keep in perspective. I also think Vicente Silva is a great example to use here. He, too, was an outlaw from New Mexico from around the same time period, and just like the kid, Silva's exploits and name were printed in newspapers as far away as New York City. Hell, Vicente even had twice as much money on his head as Billy did. But you've never heard of him, right? Mostly because nobody's ever made any movies about Vicente Silva. And guess what? Despite Vicente's fame, despite him being twice as wanted as the kid, there are also no death photos of him either. This whole no picture thing is just something that people fixate on that has no bearing to the facts. And then there's the logistics. There was no photographer living at Fort Sumner, and I doubt there was one within 100 miles. I'm not sure why Garrett would have gone through all the trouble to locate one, pay for him to travel all the way to Fort Sumner, while the entire time Billy's body is just getting nice and ripe in the summer heat, just to take a photograph of a dead body that everybody had already seen. I think there's something like almost 50 witnesses that we know for a fact by their names that saw Billy's body, and that's not counting the other 100 or so people that were at Fort Sumner on that very day. People that almost certainly attended the funeral. I know conspiracy theories are fun, and I know it sucks that Billy the Kid was shot dead at such a young age, but there is simply no substance whatsoever to the idea that it was all a hoax. Alright, I'll shut up now, get off my soapbox. Toward the end of July, Pat departed Santa Fe alone and via horseback for Las Vegas. He could have taken the train, but I guess he wanted to clear his mind. He had done his duty, despite what his critics may have said, and was likely considering his next move. Would he run for a second term as sheriff? At what point did he discover that Billy the Kid was indeed an extraterrestrial? Was it the moment before he pulled the trigger, or as they were preparing the body for burial? Is that why there were no photos of a dead William H. Bonney? Or was there a picture and the aliens stole it? Speaking of aliens, when would they come and exact revenge? And what would Pat get up to for the next 28 years of his life? In February of 1896, Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son Henry vanished off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. The pair had been traveling near the present-day White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico when disaster struck. An abandoned wagon and bloodstains the only clues alluding to their fate. To this day, no bodies have been discovered, and although suspects abound, ultimately, no one would be held responsible. Who was Albert Jennings Fountain? What dark secrets did he uncover that made him a target for the unthinkable? And what the hell does all this have to do with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid? To say that Albert Jennings Fountain led an interesting life would be an understatement. Both an outspoken critic of and apologist for the notorious Billy the Kid, a politician, a lawyer, a very opinionated journalist, and a combat veteran. He also just happens to be at the center of one of the greatest whodunits in Old West history. Originally from Staten Island, Fountain headed west to California in the 1850s after graduating from Columbia. He worked as a journalist for a while in Sacramento and even traveled to Nicaragua covering William Walker's filibuster expedition. By 1860, Albert was admitted to the California State Bar, and when the war between the states broke out, he enlisted in the 1st California Infantry, quickly rising in rank from private to lieutenant. Although his unit did not reach New Mexico in time to expel the Confederates, Fountain was part of the occupying force stationed first out of El Paso and then Mesilla. Matter of fact, it was there in Mesilla where he met his future wife, Mariana, with whom he would have 6 children. Albert was involved in the relocation of the Mescalero Apache to the Bosque Redondo, and on several different occasions would command a detachment of volunteers, sustaining injuries in the process. After one especially bloody engagement with the Apache, Fountain spent the night under his dead horse, arrows sticking out of his arm and shoulder along with a bullet in the thigh. Following a convalescence at Fort Bliss, Albert was discharged and settled in with his new bride right there in El Paso. He began practicing law, helped to found a church, and played a key role in organizing the Republican Party of West Texas. This is in addition to also working as county surveyor and a collector of customs. Busy little beaver, this Albert. Now, Fountain's political beliefs did not do him any favors in Reconstruction, Texas, and neither did his former service in the Union Army. Nonetheless, he would be elected as a state senator. A talented orator who wasn't afraid to quote-unquote tell it like it is, there's no wonder that Albert gained quite a few enemies. And remember, this is in the 1800s, back when politicians sometimes resorted to shedding each other's blood over disagreements. Fountain would be challenged to several duels, at least one of which turned fatal when he shot and killed his political adversary, Frank Williams. After achieving a leadership position in the Texas Senate, the Reconstruction movement began losing power, and as it diminished, so did Fountain's popularity. Ended up moving his family to Mesilla, New Mexico in 1873, where he would once again jump headfirst into politics, serving as the Speaker of the House in the New Mexico Territorial House of Representatives. In 1879, Fountain became the captain of a local militia, the Mesilla Scouts, continued to practice law, and founded a newspaper called the Mesilla Independent. Back when Billy the Kid was still riding with Jesse Evans, Fountain was one of their most vocal critics, printing many an article condemning the bandits, and sticking his neck out while doing so. Ironically, once Billy the Kid was finally arrested and forced to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff Brady, it was Albert Fountain who was appointed as his attorney. Obviously, that didn't turn out too well for Billy, but there's no denying that by the latter part of the 19th century, Albert Jennings Fountain was not only one of the most prominent attorneys in New Mexico, but also one of the most well-known public figures. And by the mid-1890s, Albert was busy working as a special investigator and prosecutor for the New Mexico Stock Growers Association. It was a never-ending job back in those days keeping the theft in check, but Fountain seemed to be doing his part. Hell, he alone was responsible for sending over a dozen rustlers to prison, and by January of 1896, he secured an additional 32 indictments against 23 men accused of everything from stealing cattle to altering brands. Now, those indictments were drawn up at the courthouse in Lincoln, the same courthouse that Billy the Kid escaped from 15 years prior. And some of them were against members of law enforcement, men who also happened to be close allies with Fountain's most bitter political rival. And despite having his life threatened on more than one occasion, most recently right there in Lincoln, Albert pushed on, just he and his son in a wagon, as they made their way back home to Mesilla. And just 3 days into their journey, on February 1st, 1896, the father and son met their mysterious fate. It was later determined that the wagon had veered off the trail, followed by additional horse tracks. All that was initially found was some dried blood and 3 empty brass cartridges, but 10 miles further, the buckboard was located. Empty, of course, along with Fountain's briefcase. Those indictments it once held, much like Albert and Henry, were nowhere to be found. It doesn't take an Einstein to deduce that the pair came to a tragic end, right? And additional clues at the scene led investigators to suspect that the bodies had been wrapped up and tied on the backs of horses before getting hauled away. Then New Mexico Governor William Thornton organized a committee that hired none other than the celebrated lawman Pat Garrett to come and search for Fountain and his boy, and hopefully figure out what the hell had happened and who was responsible. Now, we will return to the Fountain disappearance very shortly, but just real quick, this is part 4 in a series on Pat Garrett. In the previous 3 installments, we discussed Pat's origin story, his life before becoming the sheriff of Lincoln County, and his relationship with Billy the Kid. But what was Pat up to for the 15 years following the kid's death, until he took over the investigation into Albert and his boy? Well, it turns out quite a bit. The dirt on Billy the Kid's grave was still fresh when dime novels started popping up on newsstands, portraying the outlaw as a near saint and Pat Garrett as a cowardly, monstrous ghoul. That being the case, Pat decided to write his own book, maybe answer a few of the lies, and hopefully even make a profit while doing so. Sadly for him, this would not be the case. First of all, a good chunk of the book was penned by a ghost author named Ash Upson. Coincidentally, Ash lived with Billy Bonney and his mother years prior in Silver City, back when the kid was literally a kid. And later, Upson lived and worked in Roswell, where he continued his acquaintance with Billy. The two absolutely did know each other, so Ash was not simply an outsider looking in. That said, he did lay it on a mite too thick when it came to writing the story. A book whose ultimate title would be The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, the noted desperado of the Southwest whose deeds of daring and blood made his name a terror in New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. Now, this so-called biography would turn out to be a big flop, selling relatively few copies during Pat's lifetime, and definitely not delivering much in the way of a steady paycheck. Of course, by then, Garrett was ready to move on to something a little more respectable. He decided not to run for a second term as sheriff, and instead supported his friend, Deputy John W. Poe, who would end up easily taking the election. And it's not so much that Pat was tired of public service, he just had his eyes on a much bigger prize: the New Mexico Territorial Council. Now, I didn't know exactly what this council was, but thanks to friend of the show, the Man of Enchantment, I learned that when New Mexico became a state in 1912, the council was replaced by a state senate. So I assumed that this job Garrett was after was basically the territorial equivalent of a senator. By the way, this is also around the time when a very interesting, yet relatively unknown, meeting occurred between Pat Garrett and Joseph Antrim, the brother of Billy the Kid. Rumor had it that Joseph was looking to avenge his sibling's death, and should it ever be Pat Garrett's misfortune to run into the young gambler, that badge of his wasn't going to offer up much protection. As one paper put it, Joseph, quote, hankered for the blood of Pat Garrett. Now, you may remember that Joseph and Billy were made orphans back in Silver City when their mama Catherine died of consumption. And although the townsfolk were kind enough to take the brothers in, they were ultimately separated. Billy, or Henry as he was known back in those days, went to live with the Truesdells, while Joseph was placed in the care of Joe Dyer and his family, who incidentally operated a saloon called the Orleans Club. It's there where a teenage Joseph went to work, cleaning up, running errands, even tending bar on occasion, and of course, learning how to gamble, a vocation he would take to rather quickly and pursue for the rest of his life. And while Joseph was not a gunfighter per se, or even an outlaw like his brother, he was no stranger to violence. I mean, you can't just ply your trade in these dark saloons and dingy gambling halls there on the frontier and not learn a thing or two about staying alive. Hell, he was once even fined in Tombstone for fighting, but that's a different story. Now, whether or not Pat heard about these threats and purposely went looking for Joseph, or whether they met by happenstance is unknown, but they did meet, a rendezvous that took place in Albuquerque during the summer of 1882. And as the two men came face to face there in the Armijo Hotel, things got tense and quick. And I'm positive that none of the nervous spectators could have predicted what happened next. Nobody knows for certain what was said, but Pat and Joseph sat down together and began talking. And they continued to talk for the better part of 2 hours. When the conversation was over, the pair rose from their seats, shook hands, and went their separate ways. Joseph would later say that he had a, quote, better understanding of what had happened, end quote. Now, a lot of people don't even realize that the kid had a brother, much less one that lived all the way up to 1930. As far as anyone knows, he and Garrett never met again. Now, as far as Pat's political aspirations went, with that territorial council, not everybody was supportive. Indeed, his detractors began coming out of the woodwork and bashing his name in the papers. One anonymous critic in particular, who signed his name with the letter X, made it abundantly clear that he did not think Pat was qualified for the position. And, well, it didn't turn out so good for Mr. X. Garrett didn't much appreciate the negative press, and what's more, he was pretty sure he knew who the mystery man was. An old boy named William Roberts, who, rumor has it, was also talking shit about Garrett's wife, Apollinaria. Oh boy. Sure enough, one day Pat decides to pay Mr. Roberts a visit, pulling a Will Smith while doing so, pistol whipping the man and telling him to keep his wife's name out of his motherfucking mouth. Now, as you can probably imagine, after this, Pat would not be elected to the council. So he instead focused on his own ranching interest there in Lincoln County. At least he did until the spring of 1884 when he was once more called upon to help fight ne'er-do-wells. It seems those ranchers up in the Texas Panhandle had gotten themselves in quite a bit of a pickle and needed Garrett's assistance. I did go over this recently in the episode I did on the big fight at Jenkins Saloon, but here's just a quick rundown to get you up to speed. According to newspapers at the time, between 200 to 300 Texas Panhandle cowboys, including them employed on the big ranches, all walked off the job shortly before the big spring roundup of 1883. They posted a list of demands, most of which were calling for a substantial raise in pay, and cautioned that anybody who ignored these stipulations would suffer the consequences. Oh my. Ultimately, the whole thing didn't amount to a hill of beans. The striking cowhands soon ran out of money and were forced to return back to their employers, 10-gallon hats in hand. Them that would take them back, that is. Many of the out-of-work cowboys soon found themselves blacklisted and unable to find work within several hundred miles. So some of them just took out their frustrations on their former bosses. Fences were cut, livestock was stolen, and pastures were burned. Hell, one group of out-of-work cowboys even took to calling themselves the Get Even Cattle Company. Now, how much of this rank thievery and mayhem truly occurred is somewhat contested, and the strike, as well as its aftermath, were largely blown out of proportion by the newspapers. That said, there was enough of a problem with stolen livestock for the big spreads, namely the LS, to bring in some outside help. And who better to call than the former sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico himself, Pat Garrett. Still high off his reputation as being the man who killed Billy the Kid, Garrett signed on at $5,000 a year, over $150,000 in today's money, and formed what was called the Home Rangers. Now, I'm not certain how official this group was. Legend has it that Pat Garrett received a commission from then Texas Governor John Ireland, but no such record has yet to be discovered. So whether or not they were officially official, or this was just sort of a wink and nod type of deal, either way, I'm pretty positive that Garrett and the LS Ranch had the full approval of the Texas government. With that in mind, I do think it's important to point out that these guys were not Texas Rangers, despite using the name Ranger in their title. According to historian Leon Metz, many of the smaller ranchers and homesteaders, thinking that these developments were just a way for the big cattlemen to take over the entire country, started to sneeringly refer to Garrett's outfit as the LS Rangers. And they might have been onto something, as the Rangers' ranks were packed with LS employees, some of whom coincidentally had been with Garrett over at Stinking Springs when he arrested Billy Bonney and Rudaball and them others. Hell, Jim East, the sheriff of Oldham County, where Tascosa is located, was also a former deputy of Garrett's, and he flat out warned Pat about these new recruits, saying that he didn't want nothing to do with them. And I reckon Pat, to his credit, soon came to the same conclusion. Garrett quickly caught on to the fact that he was basically being paid to kill folks for the big outfit, as opposed to bringing them to trial, so he simply handed in his papers and the LS Rangers were disbanded. By January of 1885, Pat moved his family to Las Vegas and took up employment as the chief of the Southwest Livestock Detective Agency. Same sort of work he was supposed to have been doing up there in the Panhandle. Now, at this point, Pat and Apollinaria already had 3 children, Ida, Dudley Poe, and Elizabeth, who was blind. Apparently, she was born with bad eyesight to begin with, and a doctor in Roswell assured Pat that he could fix her right up. Only thing is, whatever that Sawbones did made it worse, and poor Elizabeth lost her sight entirely. The doctor wisely moved the hell out of town. Thankfully, Elizabeth Garrett does seem to have risen above her handicap. She would remember her father fondly in the years to come, and speak often of how he would urge patience and advise her to think your way out, daughter, and keep your head clear above your heart. And years later, it was Elizabeth Garrett who would compose the New Mexico state song, "O Fair New Mexico," which remains the official song to this day. This is also roundabout when Garrett went into business with a rich Scotsman named Brandon Kirby, helping him to acquire land and cattle over in Lincoln County. Not only did Pat assist the aristocrat in buying several ranches, but he even became Kirby's first ranch manager. A very short-lived venture, as the two men just did not get along, and a very bad drought struck the Southwest, causing a sudden drop in cattle prices. With no money to be made in beef, Pat moved his family once again to Roswell and took to farming and breeding horses. and getting really into irrigation. He and a few others founded the Pecos Irrigation and Investment Company, and by 1889 had irrigated over 40,000 acres. They even built a town, Eddy, which would later change its name to Carlsbad. I hear that there's a cavern there. And not only did Pat help start this irrigation company, he also planted several hundred apple trees, went partners with a livery stable and a blacksmith shop, and even operated a dairy. And all of this is by the time he's 40 years old. Not too bad, in my opinion. You know, someone told me recently that they thought Garrett was a lifelong failure, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. The man was a hard worker, he was clearly ambitious, and from what I found while doing research, he did seem to invest much of his profits back into these different businesses, at least at first. Unfortunately, Pat would have certain vices, which we will be getting to soon enough, and these vices would be his ultimate undoing. Now, this irrigation business would go belly up, but it doesn't really appear to have been Pat's fault so much as just the price of doing business, much in the same way that a small mom-and-pop store can't keep up with Walmart. In 1890, the Garrett family welcomed another daughter, Anna, and Pat decided to run for sheriff of the newly minted Chavez County. He would lose, however, after his old friend John W. Poe turned against him and campaigned on the behalf of another man. Now, you gotta remember, these two were very close at one point. Hell, Garrett even named his first son after Poe. So what the hell happened? Well, the same thing that has soured many a friendship in the past. Money. Despite Pat being heavily involved in all those different businesses, he was also, nearly always, broke. And he was broke because he just could not stop gambling. He also had the very bad habit of not paying his friends back after he borrowed money from them, which appears to be what happened between him and Poe, ultimately ruining their relationship. Fed up with New Mexico altogether, Garrett uprooted his family and they all moved to the big city of Uvalde, Texas, where he committed himself wholly to gambling and racing horses. During this time frame, Pat traveled extensively, all over Texas, New Mexico, and even as far away as New Orleans, racing ponies. And his finances continued to plummet. In a letter to Apollinaria sent during one such adventure, Pat wrote, quote, "Dear wife, I have been awake for 2 hours. Woke up at 1 o'clock and can't sleep and have got up and lit my pipe. What a terrible thing it is for a man to be so poor that he is compelled to stay away from his wife and children. I hope you are not as bothered as I am. It seems now as if I will not be able to leave here until the races are over. I still hope to make some money so I can pay what we owe. We'll be home by April and hope I will never have to go anywhere again without you were with me." End quote. Now, I don't know whether or not Pat won it big at the races on that occasion, but he certainly would go many, many places without his wife and family in the years to come, especially after February of 1896, when he was enlisted to track down the killer or killers of his old friend, Albert Jennings Fountain. That's right, we're getting back into old Fountain now. According to another letter that Pat wrote his wife, he accepted the job as investigator at $150 per month, with expenses paid, along with a promised $8,000 bonus if he's able to arrest and see to the conviction of Albert's murderers. Now, $8,000 in 1896 is almost $300,000 in today's money, and that $150 per month is like $5,400 when adjusted for inflation. So not only was Garrett motivated out of having a past friendship with Fountain, who, by the way, had supported his failed bid for the Territorial Council, but should Pat be successful, this would likely see he and his family out of their mountain financial problems. Also, Garrett suspected that another perk would be his eventual election as sheriff of Donna Ana County. By February 29th, just weeks after the disappearance, Pat was out scouring the countryside, seeing what he could turn up. And with him was Chavez County Sheriff Charles C. Perry, who just a year prior had helped capture the noted outlaw Bill Cook up in Indian Territory. You may remember him from the series I did on Cherokee Bill. Now, Garrett and Perry spent a week out there in the desert, but came up empty-handed, so they returned to Las Cruces. Of course, by then, the names of several likely suspects were already being bandied about, with an old boy named Oliver Lee at the top of the list. Now, Oliver Milton Lee was a local rancher and deputy sheriff, who also just happened to be one of the men who Fountain had recently helped to indict on cattle rustling charges. Hell, word has it that he had even stolen stock from Susan McSween, the widow of Alexander McSween. Apparently, after her husband's death during the Battle of Lincoln, she went on to become one of the most successful female ranchers in all of New Mexico history. Lee was also a very close ally of Albert Bacon Fall, The guy I alluded to earlier as being Fountain's main political rival. And the word rival really doesn't do it justice. The two Alberts, Fall and Fountain, fucking hated each other. And boy, oh boy, is Albert Bacon Fall going to be popping up quite a bit more for the rest of this series. Now back to the evidence against Lee, it wasn't just rumors. His boot prints matched those found at the scene of the abandoned wagon, and tracks from his horse were located nearby as well. Yet another set of footprints were said to have matched those of William McNew, also a deputy sheriff and the husband of Oliver Lee's niece. And conveniently enough, McNew was also named in those Fountain indictments. And then you had a guy named Jim Gilliland. I'm going to struggle pronouncing this guy's last name. It's spelled Gililland, so Gilliland, Gilliland. Look, there's no way I'm going to be able to say that over and over again without fucking it up. So I'm just going to call him Jim Gilland, okay? Now, this Jim Gilland guy was heard bragging that if Albert and his son's bodies had to be found before someone could be convicted, then that conviction would be a long time coming. And when asked about Fountain's 8-year-old son, whose mother was Hispanic, Gilland replied that the kid was, quote, nothing but a half-breed and to kill him was like killing a dog, end quote. So yeah, real nice guy. And by the way, as was the case with Oliver Lee, both Jim Gilland and William McNew were also buddies with Albert Bacon Fall. What's more, some even suspected that Fall was the mastermind behind the whole thing, that he had enlisted Lee and the others to murder Fountain. Now, I know I kind of already touched on the fact that Fall and Fountain hated each other, and as far as I can tell, it does seem that this hatred stems solely from politics. Other than that, the two guys really weren't all that different. The Kentucky-born Albert Bacon Fall had, just like Fountain, spent time in Texas before moving to New Mexico. He was admitted to the bar in 1891, served in the Territorial Council and the New Mexico House of Representatives, and by 1893 was appointed as judge for the 3rd Judicial District, in addition to being an associate justice of New Mexico's Supreme Court. Later in life, he would switch parties, but at this time, Fall was a big driving force in New Mexico's Democratic Party, whereas Fountain was a Republican. Both of these guys were very outspoken, very opinionated, and very political. And we all know how politics can rot the brain. And just to show how deep the hatred went between the two Alberts, Fall began spreading rumors that Fountain had been caught in a, quote, compromising situation with one of his daughters, thus prompting him to orchestrate his own disappearance. Now, even though almost everybody suspected that Oliver Lee and his buddies were to blame, you can't exactly arrest anyone on hearsay, right? I mean, you can, but if you want a conviction in a court of law, you're going to need some hard evidence, which is what Pat Garrett was trying to uncover. Now, much to his annoyance, the governor enlisted the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who sent in operative John C. Frazier. Pat was initially hesitant to enlist the private eye's help, but eventually had him go around and spread word that Oliver Lee, Gilland, and McNew were no longer suspects. I guess the idea was to create the illusion that they were in the clear, thus hoping that they'd let their guards down, much in the same way that Garrett did with Billy the Kid back many years before. And when Pat encountered Oliver Lee and company on the streets, he was cordial if not friendly, all still with this idea of throwing them off their game. The investigation would encounter a bit of a setback 2 months in, however, when Pat's partner, Charles Perry, ran off with several $1,000s worth of Chavez County tax money. Really strange guy, this Perry. I need to look into him more, but his story is wild. He apparently plotted to murder John Wesley Hardin at one point, and then once he stole all that money, he was reported to have joined up with the outlaw Blackjack Ketchum, who, funny enough, was also considered a suspect in the death of Albert Jennings Fountain. Years later, numerous reports surfaced of Perry meeting his demise in Africa, either at the hands of Bantu tribesmen or killed by Boers while serving in the British Army, or just being murdered over a gambling dispute in Johannesburg. It was his theft of all that money, by the way, that caused New Mexico to finally change the law and make it to where the collection of tax money was no longer the sheriff's responsibility. By August of 1896, with Fountain's disappearance remaining a mystery, Pat was appointed as sheriff of Donna Ana County, and by November was running for the election of the same post, with the daughter of Albert Jennings Fountain even making a speech on his behalf, stating that only with Garrett as sheriff would her father and brother's murderers be brought to justice. The crowd was teary-eyed by the time she was done, and Pat, sure enough, won the election. As was the case years before in Lincoln, Garrett received a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and although he continued to investigate the Fountain case, he made little to no headway. Part of this was due to Albert Bacon Fall's influence over certain courts and his expert manipulation of the legal system. Still, though, by the time March of 1898 rolled around, it was suspected that Fall, along with Oliver Lee and the others, would be indicted. Shortly before this was to occur, Pat stopped at a saloon in Tularosa where Fall and Lee were playing poker, along with a guy named George Curry. They asked Garrett to join in, which he did, sitting opposite of Lee. Hours passed as hand after hand of poker was played, and while other players routinely came and went from the table, Garrett and Lee continued to face each other, both of them wary to turn their backs. I guess the reason being was that Lee was said to be a bad man with a gun, who had already killed in the past and even participated in a range war. According to the aforementioned George Curry, this game lasted for 3 days. Now, I don't know about that, but by the time it was over, Garrett asked to speak with Oliver Lee in private, and he asked Curry to join them as a witness. Once behind closed doors, Pat asked Lee, "Why don't you like me?" To which Lee replied, "What the fuck you talking about? I like you." Garrett replied, "No, you don't. I see the little looks you give me. I've been trying to be your friend this whole time, and no matter what I do, you won't accept my friendship. What the fuck, bro?" At this point, Lee's blushing. He's like, "Look, man, I like you. What do you want me to do? Kiss you?" Garrett smiles and kind of looks off to the side, and then he looks back at Lee and says, "Well, I wouldn't stop you if you did." And per George Curry, quote, "I witnessed Oliver Lee and Pat Garrett embrace and kiss, a kiss that I have only seen lovers, madly in love, consummate," end quote. And no, I made all that shit up. No, it actually happened. Once behind closed doors, Garrett asked Lee bluntly how he would like him, Pat, to serve the indictment that everybody knew was coming. Oliver informed Pat that he would have absolutely no trouble serving a warrant and assured him that he would not resist arrest. Well, to everyone's surprise, especially Garrett's, the grand jury did not issue any indictments whatsoever. Pat then angrily petitioned a judge to at least issue bench warrants for Lee, McNew, and Gilland, and a new suspect, William Carr, who was accused of helping to trail the Fountains for Lee and the others. Pat provided affidavits in support of this petition, and he was successful. Warrants in hand, Garrett wasted no time in arresting McNew and Carr, but Oliver Lee and Gilland wouldn't be so easy. Lee got word of the warrants and fled to El Paso, sending word that if the court would promise a reasonable bail, he'd turn himself in. But if he was just meant to rot in jail indefinitely, nah, he'd pass. Despite this defiance, and despite being on the lam, Lee would soon return to one of his satellite ranches in New Mexico, about halfway between Alamogordo and Las Cruces. Garrett got wind and quickly raised a posse, arriving at Lee's spread at around 4:30 in the morning, spying both Lee and James Gilland's horses in the corral, along with the horse of a guy named Prent Rode, Lee's future brother-in-law and someone we will be discussing later in regard to another mysterious death. And just as Pat had opted to do more than once in the past, rather than wait, he and his men kicked the door down and burst right into the ranch house, guns leveled. Turns out the inhabitants were just a couple of cowboys, along with their wives and young children, all of whom were terrified at this early morning intrusion. Garrett interrogated the two hands as to the location of his prey, but they claimed not to have any information. Finally, just at first light, Pat and the posse were milling about outside, and they noticed one of the cowboys motioning to somebody up on the roof. Looking closer, Garrett noticed that there was a ladder leaning against the house, and, as it turns out, both Lee and Gilland had spread their bedrolls up there and spent the night, just to be on the safe side. Now, some 50-odd feet away was a shed, which Pat and several of his men climbed up on top of as posse member Ben Williams took up position behind a water tank. From the roof of that shed, they called out for the wanted men to surrender. And call it nerves or whatever, in the same breath they called out for him to surrender, one of the posse men let loose a round from his rifle. Predictably, chaos ensued, with the rest of the posse opening up fire, and Lee and Gilland doing the same. And effectively at that, Deputy H.K. Kearney took a bullet through the shoulder, followed by another in the leg as the lawmen found out just how bad of a disadvantage they had found themselves. Lee and Gilland were both crouched behind thick adobe, whereas the only thing separating Pat and his boys from those rifle rounds was sheet metal and thin wooden boards. Pat's face was soon peppered with splinters, and he narrowly dodged a bullet aimed for his head before slipping down to the ground and trying to pull Kearney to safety. The entire time, bullets just slapping all around them, and Lee yelling out that they were bastards for ordering a man to throw his hands up and firing at the same time. Oliver followed that up by telling Garrett that he had, quote, got yourself in a hell of a close place, to which Pat replied, I know it. Half-heartedly, Garrett tried to talk him into surrendering, but Lee knew he had the upper hand and refused. Besides, he had heard through the grapevine that Pat was planning on killing him before they got to the jailhouse. Garrett countered that that was not true and that they'd be perfectly safe in his hands if only they would surrender. No dice. Instead, Oliver told Pat that if he and his posse would pull out and give he and Gilland a little distance, they would refrain from shooting as they left their cover and skedaddled. You ain't gonna shoot us in the back, are you? Pat asked, to which Gilland responded, you know damn well we won't. And true to their word, the wanted men held their fire as Pat and the others looked at Kearney's wounds. The outlaws grew impatient, though, and ordered the posse to skin out. Kearney could lay where he was. And as embarrassing as I'm sure it was, Garrett did just that, leaving the wounded man behind as he and the rest of the men made their way back to town. Sadly, Kearney would die of his wounds 2 days later. Now, the following day, Oliver Lee hauled ass to a bank, withdrew all of his money, and lit out for the middle of nowhere, just laying low. And when the Donna Ana grand jury did finally issue that indictment, Lee swore that he would never let Pat Garrett take him alive. Guess he was still mad about that posse opening up fire after telling him to surrender. As for Albert Bacon Fall, he was still not under indictment. Hell, when all this was going on, he became a captain in the New Mexico Volunteers bound for service in the Spanish-American War. Garrett tried to join as well, but the governor forbid it as long as Lee and Gilland were still on the lam. Now, earlier I mentioned an old boy named George Curry, who was at that poker game. He was a friend of Oliver Lee's. Well, Curry ran for and was elected as the sheriff over in Otero County. Lee then sent Curry a letter saying that he would surrender to him as long as Pat Garrett wasn't around and so long as he didn't have to spend not 1 minute in Garrett's Donna Ana jail. Sheriff Curry agreed, as did a judge out of Las Cruces, and by mid-March 1899, both Lee and Gilland boarded a train bound for Las Cruces. What they didn't know was that Pat Garrett was on the same damn train. Hell, Pat didn't know it either. This was a surprise for all involved. Upon noticing the sheriff, both outlaws laid low, slinking in their seats and holding up newspapers over their faces as Garrett was none the wiser until the train arrived at its destination. That friendly judge was waiting at the depot, so Lee and Gilland both ran off and into his protection, and that was that. It's reported that once Garrett learned that they had just been within his grasp, he was, quote, considerably chagrined, end quote. I think that's the fancy talk for being pissed off. And guess who the defense attorney was? None other than the man who some think ordered the dastardly deed in question, Albert B. Fall. The Spanish-American War only lasted like 5 seconds, and he and his volunteers never even left the country. Fall arrived back in New Mexico just in time to head up the defense team. And the lead prosecutor was crooked-ass Thomas Catrone, one-time honcho of the infamous Santa Fe Ring. Now, this trial made national headlines, but in the end, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty. Much of the evidence was circumstantial, and Albert Fall did one hell of a job discrediting the witness testimony. Plus, the whole thing became extremely political, with the Democrats and Republicans using this as an opportunity to bash each other rather than attempting to seek justice for Fountain and his little boy. Guess some things never change, huh? Nobody would ever again stand trial for the disappearance of Albert Jennings Fountain or his son Henry. And to this day, nobody truly knows what happened. If Fountain and Henry were murdered, as most assume is the case, we still don't know for sure who did it or why. I mean, some even think that the outlaw Black Jack Ketchum was involved. His brother Sam Ketchum claimed that Jack confessed to it, but at this point in our timeline, Black Jack was already dead himself, so who knows? That detective from the Pinkertons, John Frazier, seemed pretty confident that it all led back to Oliver Lee, and in the eyes of many, Lee still remains the most likely suspect. Supposedly Jim Gilland, in his later years, confessed that the bodies were buried on his ranch, and even gave a friend of his a Masonic pin that he took off of Fountain, a pin that the Fountain family said did indeed belong to Albert. But as of yet, no bodies have been located, at least not that I'm aware of. I think I did read something in regard to some charred remains that were found, but A, I'm not sure how true this is, and B, if it is true, I don't know that anyone has ever proved it was Albert and his boy. And despite Oliver Lee probably being a murderer, he would go on to be elected several times as both a New Mexico state representative and senator. Lee lived all the way till 1941 and even has a damn park named after him, the Oliver Lee Memorial State Park. As far as Albert Bacon Fall, there's no proof that he ordered or otherwise orchestrated Fountain's demise. And even those that are pretty convinced that Oliver Lee was the killer aren't so positive that Fall was involved. If anything, he was just guilty of being an asshole. Now, he would go on to serve time in prison, but it would be over a completely different crime, one that I'm positive you heard about back in history class. For now, though, Fall would still remain a part of Pat Garrett's life, and in a pretty surprising way. That said, I do want to make an update. I expressed confusion on an earlier episode, part 2 in this series, as to whether or not Garrett was given the $500 reward after arresting Billy the Kid at Stinking Springs. And thanks to my friend Ben Doss from the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition, I have learned that yes, Pat was given that initial reward in February of 1881. This is not the same $500 he was awarded after killing Billy the Kid, which he also got. This is just for the arrest of the kid. All right, back to 1899. Now, following that disappointing not guilty verdict in the Albert Jennings Fountain case, Pat Garrett went back to his normal duties as sheriff of Donna Ana County, a job that would see him involved in yet another shooting. A lawman from Indian Territory paid Garrett a visit, looking for a wanted fugitive with the unfortunate name of Norman Newman. Said he had reason to believe that this man was employed as a cook on the nearby ranch of W.W. Cox, under the assumed name of Billy Reed. Garrett grabbed one of his deputies, Jose Espelin, and they, along with that visiting sheriff, headed for the Cox spread. Upon arrival, Garrett easily located Newman, washing dishes in the kitchen, and approached, asking, "Are you Mr. Reed?" "Yes," replied the wanted man. "My name's Garrett. I'm the sheriff of this county, and I got a warrant for you." "All right, Mr. Garrett," Newman replied, seemingly unconcerned. And then, as Pat went to reach for his handcuffs, the fugitive pounced, smashing his fist straight into Garrett's face and making a run for it. And although Pat was quick and grabbed a hold of him, Newman just kept on a-going, dragging the nearly 6.5-foot tall sheriff behind him. At this point, Deputy Epsilon comes running in, shucking his revolver, only to have Pat yell out for him not to shoot. Guess he wanted to take Newman alive. So Jose does the next best thing and proceeds to bring the butt of that pistol down over the outlaw's head, more than once. This drives Norman to his knees, but just as Pat is once more fumbling for those cuffs, here comes a damn bulldog hopping up and attacking Deputy Espelin. Not making this up. With Garrett momentarily distracted, Newman gets to his feet, swinging his fist wildly, and running off yet again, allegedly straight for a revolver inside of the Cox ranch house. Before he's able to get his hands on it, however, 2 shots are fired, and Billy Reed, aka Norman Newman, falls dead to the ground. Now, I read a couple accounts of this little dust-up, and it's hard to tell whether or not the entire fight took place inside the house and who actually killed Newman. According to Pat Garrett himself, as told to his friend Emerson Huff, it started in the kitchen, spilled out onto the porch, and then after that bulldog got involved, that's when Newman made a mad dash back into the house, presumably for a gun, and then Pat claimed that his, quote, Mexican, referring to Deputy Espelin, shot the fugitive twice in the back. By the way, oddly enough, that bulldog was owned by none other than Albert B. Fall. We spoke quite a bit about Mr. Fall last week, and he just continues popping up in Garrett's life in the weirdest of ways. And although a coroner's inquest would exonerate both Garrett and his deputy, it didn't help patch up feelings with the Cox family, who owned that ranch where the killing took place. Now let's talk about this W.W. Cox guy real quick. Full name William Webb Cox, he had, as a younger man, been involved in the Sutton-Taylor feud over in Texas. Took part in the murder of a doctor and his son, and later moved to New Mexico, where he reinvented himself as the respectable rancher W.W. Cox. Now here's where things get a little crazy. Oliver Lee, whom we also discussed extensively in the previous episode, prime suspect in the disappearance of Albert Jennings Fountain, was sweet on and would eventually marry Cox's sister-in-law. And the day before Pat Garrett and his posse got into that shootout with Lee and his buddy Gilland, the pair had been hanging out right there at the Cox Ranch. Then there's Print Road, yet another in-law of W.W. Cox. Print supplied the horses to Oliver Lee back when he was on the lam, and it does not appear that he had any love in his heart whatsoever for old Pat Garrett. And that little fight there at the ranch would only further exasperate matters. Print's sister, who also happened to be the wife of W. W. Cox, was pregnant at the time and in the house when Norman Newman was shot to death. This really pissed Rhodes off because he felt like Pat had needlessly placed his sister and all the other women who happened to be in the house that day in harm's way. And when I say that Print was pissed off, he even threatened to kill Pat Garrett right then and there. Now, Rhodes had the reputation of a guy who wanted to be tough. And you know how people like that are, right? Always trying to prove something. Apparently, this caused a lot of folks to not want anything to do with the man, but he did seem to get along just fine with everyone there at the Cox Ranch. Now, on that day in question, cooler heads prevailed, and there was no further bloodshed. And if all this just seems inconsequential, I promise you, I'm bringing it all up for a reason. You're going to hear a lot more about Print Rhodes and Mr. Cox coming up very shortly. In February of 1900, not too long after that shooting at the Cox Ranch, a couple of criminals named William Wilson and Oscar Wilbur robbed the bank right there in Las Cruces in broad daylight, made off with over $1,000. They struck east at a gallop, and just 20 minutes later, here comes Pat Garrett in the saddle and tracking them down. Now, either they got too much of a head start, or Pat was just getting old, as he would return empty-handed. Not long thereafter, Garrett was tipped off that the duo were in San Antonio. He sent a deputy to investigate, and sure enough, the pair was located and arrested and brought back to New Mexico. Once behind bars there in Donna Ana County, Wilbur turned snitch and claimed that it was Print Rhodes and a friend of his, Will Cravens, who provided the horses that they used for that robbery. And that was all Pat needed to hear. After he and Print had that little confrontation at the Cox Ranch, he was more than happy to slap the man behind bars, which he wasted no time in doing. It was all for naught, though. Rhodes soon acquired the legal counsel of, you'll never guess who, Albert P. Fall, and being the expert litigator he was, both Print and his accomplice Cravens were found not guilty. Surprise, surprise. A turn of events that made Pat Garrett so livid that he decided not to run for another term as sheriff there in Donna Ana County. Speaking with a journalist, Pat stated that the office of sheriff no longer needed his, quote, peculiar talents in the line of good marksmanship and quick action, end quote. In other words, fuck you guys, I'm going home. And for pretty much the next year, Pat Garrett was just a private citizen. But opportunity soon came a-knocking. Following the assassination of William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt would become the nation's 26th president. And if I know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, it's that he loved his cowboys and Old West lawmen. Not only was Roosevelt aware of who Pat Garrett was, but he even appointed him to the lucrative position of El Paso's collector of customs. And in all actuality, it really wasn't all that easy. The president did not go to Garrett. He had to travel to D.C. himself in order to put the bug in Roosevelt's ear. And then once word got out that the president was considering him, a flood of opposition came rolling in, accusing Garrett of being everything from a drunkard to a gambler, an illiterate fool, and even an atheist. Now, I have, at least on one previous episode, accused Garrett of having a drinking problem, but I may have been a little mistaken. Matter of fact, when doing research for this series, I didn't really see anything proving as much. If you have information showing otherwise, please don't hesitate to hit me up, Josh at wildwestextra.com. But it does appear that while Pat was a drinker, he was also able to drink like a normal person, unlike myself. Lucky son of a bitch. As far as being a gambler, that accusation was 100% absolutely true. Indeed, Pat's gambling and his association with other gamblers would cost him dearly in the years to come. As for his literacy, that was false. Pat could read and write just fine. And the atheist thing, well, it appears that Pat was what could more accurately be categorized as agnostic. He began to question established religion at a very young age and continued to do so throughout his life. I wasn't able to find much more concerning Garrett's beliefs, but he would specifically request that there be no religious ceremonies at his funeral. By the way, I'm not really sure how his lack of religion would have stopped him from adequately performing his job, but I guess that's just politics, right? I mean, even nowadays, it's always customary for presidential candidates to espouse one denomination or another, and as far as I know, we have yet to have an openly agnostic or atheist as a president. Yet they still continue to lie like the rest of us breathe and fuck around on their wives and steal and commit all manner of reprehensible acts. But hey, at least they believe in God, or at least they claim to. Hell, at least Pat was being honest. Anyway, him and Roosevelt did have a heart-to-heart, and I guess Garrett sufficiently answered the president's questions. Rumor has it that Teddy made Garrett sign a piece of paper stating that he would not drink when on duty, thus both swearing him to sobriety and ensuring that Pat could at least write his own name. Now, this new job as a customs collector meant that Garrett was now the federal officer in charge of collecting import duties on foreign goods entering into the U.S. there on the Mexican border. Now, me personally, I've never been outside the country, and I have always been kind of curious why it is in the movies when someone lands back in the United States, they're always asked if they have anything to declare. Well, it turns out declaring is just a fancy way of saying whether or not you're bringing back goods that you purchased abroad. Not for abroad, abroad. It's my understanding that for little trinkets and souvenirs, you don't really owe anything, but on stuff valued a little bit higher, you do have to pay a duty or a tax. Plus, it's also a way of barring the entry of prohibited items. If I learned nothing from watching The Simpsons, it's that you absolutely cannot bring frogs to Australia. And I guess the same goes for here in the US in regard to other types of goods. Anyway, this was Garrett's new job down there in El Paso in a nutshell, and he did take it very seriously, strictly adhering to all the rules. Yeah, he was that guy. Pat would even make a U.S. Army general, guy by the name of Harrison Gray Otis, pay duty on all the gifts he was bringing back for his grandchildren. As you can imagine, people began to complain. And it just so happened that General Otis was also the editor of the Los Angeles Times, so he had one hell of a platform to air his grievances. To make matters worse, Pat wasn't all that overly polite while he was doing his job. He was short-tempered, rude, and just flat-out refused to cut anybody any slack, no matter who they were. Hell, Garrett was even formally reprimanded by the Secretary of the Treasury after getting into a damn fist fight with one of his own employees right there at the custom house. So the dude's walking on thin ice, right? Finally, in April of 1905, President Roosevelt visited San Antonio for a Rough Riders reunion and invited Garrett to join him, which he did, bringing his good friend Tom Powers along for the ride. No big deal other than the fact that Powers was a saloon owner and professional gambler. Not exactly the type that a sitting president in those days wanted to be publicly associated with. And sure as shit, the press got a bunch of pictures of Teddy, Garrett, and Powers all standing together, cheesing it up, and Roosevelt had to learn through the grapevine about Tom's true profession. This angered the president, and a few months later, when it came time to renew Pat's appointment as collector, Roosevelt declined to do so. Teddy would later claim that it wasn't the photos with Powers that caused this decision. And I do think he was at least partially being honest. It was that and everything else. You're never fired for being just a minute late to work, right? Chances are the guy who got fired for showing up to work just a minute late was also late on a very regular basis. Pat's appointment there in El Paso pissed off a lot of people from the get-go, especially the Texans who considered him an outsider. Then there were all the complaints and Garrett's bad relationship with the Treasury Secretary, that fight with his own employee, and yeah, finally the straw that broke the camel's back, all that bad press with Tom Powers. Roosevelt said save the drama for your mama, and that was that. Embarrassingly enough, Garrett then traveled to D.C. to plead his case in person, very stupidly bringing Tom Powers along with him. Pat even had his author friend Emerson Huff send a letter to Roosevelt, but it was no use. He was out of a job and a Texan took his place. I have a ranch in New Mexico, Garrett stated to the press, and I will go there for a time. Just what my future plans will be, I do not know. However, I am going to do something and don't expect to remain idle. I have no complaint to make against anyone for my removal. I simply take my medicine. End quote. Now, Garrett wasn't lying about not staying idle. In no time flat, he went back to doing what he'd always done, hunting down criminals. And by January of 1906, Pat was down in Chihuahua, Mexico, investigating a killing that involved an American rancher by the name of Finstead. The Mexican authorities accused Finstead of brutally murdering his brother-in-law and another man, but the rancher claimed that they were all three attacked by quote-unquote assassins. As Garrett studied the evidence, he came to the same conclusion and worked to getting Finstead freed. He even appealed to Teddy Roosevelt, but you can probably guess how that went. The Mexican court sentenced the rancher to 12 years in the pen, and that was Pat's first and last legal case he worked in Old Mexico. Meanwhile, Garrett's debts continued to mount. Instead of using that nice little salary he had as a customs collector to pay down some of his outstanding loans, he instead took to gambling. And I guess that's not exactly fair. Pat was always looking into various interests, like when he was doing all that irrigation work and running them stables and ranches and all that stuff. He was always speculating, which I guess is sort of a form of gambling, especially if everything you're investing in is what one author refers to as get-rich-quick schemes. And it's not that Pat was stingy. He was known to help his friends if they were coming up short. He may not have paid his creditors, but when he was flush, he would toss a few dollars to his buddies. Just apparently not the buddies who loaned him money in the first place. It's hard to fault Garrett on his generosity, but those debts do not just magically disappear, especially debts owed to snakes like Thomas B. Catrone of the Santa Fe Ring. Things got so bad that not only was Pat's name blacklisted in the ledgers of shop owners, but eventually the sheriff of Donna Ana County, the guy doing Pat's old job, came and seized all of his property, including the Garrett family house. All of it to be put up for auction. The only thing Pat was able to keep was a portion of his land and a homestead that was legally protected by a New Mexico statute. Any livestock he wasn't able to sneak off his property was also auctioned. And surprisingly, Albert B. Fall, yeah, him again, actually stepped in and paid off some of Pat's debts at one of those grocery stores. I guess so that his wife and kids would still be able to eat. In addition, Fall also sent Garrett a check, unprompted, for $50. Not sure how much of this was due to kindness or ulterior motives, but I doubt the disgraced lawman was feeling picky at that point. In August of 1906, Pat was somehow able to become a partner in a real estate company out of El Paso, where he began spending more and more of his time. He also had a mistress there, which might explain his absence from home. According to his friend Emerson Huff, this other woman was, quote, the only sort of indiscretion of which Garrett had been guilty. This had nothing to do with his integrity, end quote. As time went on, Pat fell into a foul mood, even writing the aforementioned Huff and complaining, everything seems to go wrong with me. It wasn't just a pity party either. The nearly 60-year-old Garrett began lashing out at others and frequently getting into fistfights, oftentimes coming out on the losing end. And by February of 1908, Garrett began feuding with a young cowboy by the name of Jesse Wayne Brazel, an employee of the Cox Ranch. Coming full circle now. Going back to the Cox. Born in 1876, Wayne Brazel was considered a good-natured kid, if not a bit slow in the head. An able cowhand who generally got along well with everyone, especially the children of Albert Fall, whom he also worked for on occasion. One of Albert's daughters, years later, would recall that she considered Brazel to be, quote, feeble-minded. And I gotta say, after looking at a few pictures of the guy, I can't help but wonder if she's onto something. There's one where Brazel is sitting down holding a teddy bear with his goofy grin on his face, and another Wayne is flanked by what appears to be two cowboys, both very somber looking, as was the norm for photos back in those days, but Wayne still has that same goofy smile just staring off into the distance. There's only so much we can tell by pictures though, right? And I guess it's always possible that Brazel was simply just a cut-up or a class clown type, just trying to make people laugh. Either way you want to cut it, he was most certainly not a likely candidate to enter into a feud with a notorious manhunter like Pat Garrett. And it all started with Wayne leasing some land that was technically owned by Pat's son, Poe. Be that as it may, Pat still considered it his property. Now, neither Pat nor Poe ran cows on this land, but they would allow Brazel to do so on the condition that he would give Pat 10 heifer calves and a colt mare in exchange for a 5-year lease. And according to Garrett, Brazel agreed, claiming that he was going to run several head of cattle, but right at the last second, he switched it up and instead moved in a herd of over 1,200 goats. This infuriated Garrett. He seemed to always be infuriated during this time period. But in this case in particular, he figured that after 5 years of goats having their way, there wouldn't be a damn thing left for any real livestock like cattle. What's more, his own damn neighbor, W.W. Cox, fronted Brazel the money for those daggum goats. And oh, it gets worse. To add insult to injury, Brazel's partner in this venture was none other than Garrett enemy, Prent Rhodes. And of course, both Cox and Prent are connected to Albert B. Fall and Oliver Lee. The plot thickens. Now, at first, Garrett tried to do things all legal-like and just void the lease, but this didn't pan out. He then attempted to get warrants sworn out for the arrest of both Rhodes and Brazel, which sounds kind of weird, but apparently Pat was just trying to get him on a technicality. Some obscure law that stated livestock couldn't graze within a certain distance of a home, something like that. In other words, Garrett was really reaching. Nonetheless, there was a hearing, and even though this was 1908, both parties came armed to the teeth. Prent Rhodes even tried to goad the former sheriff into a fight, but Pat wisely did not take the bait. The case was predictably dismissed as Pat and Rhodes swapped threats, with Pat being overheard as cryptically saying that they'd get to him if he didn't get to them first. Over the next several weeks, Garrett was on edge and continued getting into fistfights there in Las Cruces, and he continued to lose. Pat also wrote a letter to his old acquaintance, George Curry, stating, "Dear Curry, I am in a hell of a fix. I have been trying to sell my ranch, but no luck. For God's sake, send me $50. Then something very interesting happened. A feller out of El Paso by the name of James Miller stepped in and offered to buy Pat's ranch. Great news, right? This Miller guy even had 1,000 head of cattle primed and ready to move. All that had to be done now was void that lease and get those damn goats out of the way. And just in case that name slipped past you, this James Miller from El Paso was none other than Deacon Jim Miller. I did an episode on Miller a long time ago, not currently available to the general public, sorry, but I do plan on doing another series on the man in the near future. And Deacon Jim was just a real piece of work, let me tell you. Born in Arkansas in 1861, Miller is even considered to be a prime suspect in the murder of his own damn grandparents. If that's not bad enough, he would move to Texas where, in the year 1884, he shot and killed his own brother-in-law before falling in with Manny Clements, the cousin of John Wesley Hardin. Remember, Hardin and Clements were both involved with the Taylor faction during the Sutton-Taylor feud, the same side that old W.W. Cox was on. Oh boy, there goes that plot further thickening. Miller would marry into the Clements family and, believe it or not, become a lawman in Pecos, where he was accused of killing several Mexicans and even his own boss, Reeves County Sheriff Bud Frazier. And the hits just kept on a-coming. Long story short, by the turn of the century, Jim Miller was essentially the Old West version of a hired assassin. If you had somebody that needed killing, just slip old Deacon Jim some cash and he'd see to it. FYI, they called him Deacon on account of his refusal to drink or smoke and his regular church attendance. Jim Miller killed a whole hell of a lot of people, and I do find it very hard to believe that Pat Garrett did not know who he was dealing with in 1908. But money, much like pussy, tends to blind a man. Pat was desperate. He wanted to sell that property before Brazel ruined it with those goats, and hopefully make a profit while doing so and pay off some of his bills. And for once, Pat swallowed his anger and attempted a little tact. He approached Wayne as nice as could be and talked him into going to El Paso and visiting with Mr. Miller. Finally, Brazel agreed to give up the lease on one condition, that either Garrett or Miller could find someone to buy all those goats. Enter in Carl Adamson, who agreed to purchase all 1,200 goats for $3.50 apiece. An issue quickly arose, however, when Brazel went and recounted his herd and discovered that he had a total of 1,800 goats, as opposed to just 1,200. Well, I'm no mathematician, but that's 600 more goats than Adamson was interested in, and Brazel wasn't going to let go of that lease unless somebody bought all of them. In other words, the deal was off. Got to imagine Pat Garrett's blood was boiling at this point. I'm pretty sure he probably punched a couple of holes in the walls at home. The dude was within a cunt's hair getting a decent payday, and here's this smooth-brained Brazel once again causing problems. Finally, Adamson said he'd meet with both Pat and Brazel over in Las Cruces and see if they couldn't come to a mutually beneficial agreement. Okay, cool. Great. Carl ends up spending the night at Garrett's place with the idea that they'd both ride into Las Cruces the next morning, February 29th, 1908. And once there, they'd hash things out with Brazel. And yeah, I did just say February 29th. I went and double-checked it. Turns out 1908 was a leap year, hence that extra day in February. That morning, Garrett woke early and took what was considered for him unusual care in dressing, even donning a fancy Prince Albert frock coat. He kissed his wife Apollinaria goodbye, as well as the young children, and a little after 8 a.m., he and Adamson headed west in a 2-horse buggy. Now, speaking of children, I forgot to mention that Pat now had a total of 8. I think last time I mentioned the kiddos, it was just the 3 that were born between 1881 and 1884. It seems that he and Mrs. Garrett took a break for a few years and then started back up in 1890 with Anna. Then came Patrick in 1896, Pauline in 1900, Oscar in 1903, and then finally, little Jarvis in 1905. So between Pat's firstborn and Jarvis, there's a total of nearly 24 years. And all these children, save for one, would outlive Pat. Ida passed away while still a teenager in 1896. I believe it was from tonsillitis. So yeah, Pat and Adamson leaving that buggy, and Garrett, per usual, was armed. He had at his side a fancy Burgess 12-gauge folding shotgun in a custom-made leather holster. Now, I had to Google this shotgun, and if you're interested, you can find videos on YouTube. But it is not what I envisioned. It almost looks more like a lever-action rifle without the lever, if that makes any sense. Still a very beautiful firearm, though. Sort of a break-open shotgun, only this one would fold completely in half with the barrel under the stock. There's one photo I found, which appears to be a sketch, maybe for marketing back in the day, showing a man carrying the Burgess folded up and in a holster on his hip. Not sure if this is the same type of holster that Garrett had, but from what I understand, he was not wearing the shotgun on his hip, but rather carrying it separately at his side. After leaving the ranch, Pat and Adamson stopped to water their horses about a half a mile west of Oregon, and while waiting at the trough, Pat questioned a teenage employee if he had seen Brazel, and the boy answered yes, stating that Brazel had just very recently passed by. Sure enough, there was a plum of dust in the direction that the kid pointed. And once the horses drank their fill, Pat and Adamson continued on their way. A journey that Garrett would never complete. Approximately 2 hours later, Wayne Brazel came rushing into the sheriff's office in Las Cruces, visibly distressed and telling the deputies to lock him up, that he had just killed Pat Garrett. At first, they just figured Brazel was playing around and they laughed it off. It soon became apparent the goat herder was not joking, though. The deputy locked Wayne in a cell and then stepped outside to question Adamson, who was still sitting in that two-horse buggy. Deputy Lucero then had Adamson drive back out to the scene of the crime with him and a hastily assembled 7-man coroner's jury following. About 5 miles away, they came upon Pat's body, still lying there in the Alameda Aurora, and still covered with the tiny blanket that Adamson had placed over him. He had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the stomach, and he was laying on his back, a knee drawn up and both arms outstretched. After Garrett's body was taken into town and examined by a doctor, it was determined that the bullet in his head entered from behind, exiting just above his right eye. The angle of the gut shot suggested that it was either sustained when he was already on the ground or as he was falling, and the pistol slug they dug out was just behind one of his shoulders. So what the hell happened? According to Adamson, he and Pat overtook Brazel less than a mile after they left that watering hole outside of Oregon. They saw Wayne talking to someone in the road, but it was too far off to make out who, and by the time they got there, the mysterious figure had rode off. They continued to make their way to Las Cruces with Brazel trotting beside the buggy. Wasn't long before the conversation gravitated toward those damn goats, and things quickly grew heated. Pat began to somewhat verbally abuse Wayne for getting the count wrong in the first place. I mean, just how in the hell do you undercount that many goats? In his defense, Brazel just kept on saying that he was not going to sell out unless he had a buyer for all of them. End of story. At this point, Adamson, who was driving the buggy, decided to step down and guide the horses at a walk. Finally, Pat tells Brazel, "Well, I don't care whether you give up possession or not. I can get you out of there anyway." To which Wayne challenges, "I don't know whether you can or not." Now, this causes Adamson to all of a sudden need to take a piss, or so he claimed. He halts the buggy and then hands the reins to Pat before stepping away to water the dirt. Next thing he knows, Garrett is yelling, "God damn you, I will put you off now," followed immediately by a gunshot. Carl Adamson spins around, no word on whether or not he was midstream, just in time to see Pat fall backwards, followed by Brazel aiming and firing his pistol once more. Per Adamson, Garrett then stretched out, made a grunt noise, and gave up the ghost. That's when the two hurried into town and Wayne turned himself in. Brazel, of course, maintained that he only shot Pat because the former lawman was going for that shotgun. Now, this story really doesn't add up, though. First of all, it seems pretty clear that Garrett was not on that buggy when he was shot, as both Wayne and Adamson claimed. Garrett's pants were undone, and a glove was missing on his left hand, indicating that he too was standing and urinating. Also, it appeared that that shotgun was placed carefully next to the body, as opposed to just having been naturally dropped or thrown. Also, like I said a minute ago, that doctor who inspected the wounds did think that Pat was shot from behind. Garrett lay in state in Las Cruces for a total of 6 days, as thousands of people paid their respects. There were no coffins long enough to fit him, so one had to be special ordered, but finally, on March 6, 1908, Pat Garrett was laid to rest. Per his wishes, there were no religious ceremonies, and his buddy Tom Powers, that saloon owner from over El Paso way, read the eulogy, one originally used by famous agnostic Robert G. Ingersoll at his own brother's funeral. Now, Wayne Brazel was charged with murder, and his bail was quickly put up by several leading citizens of Las Cruces, including W. Cox. Those closest to Garrett soon deduced that there was more involved in his death than Adamson and Brazel were letting on, particularly the involvement of known murderer Jim Miller. Also, much like after the disappearance of Albert Jennings Fountain, rumors began spreading almost immediately, with most folks seeming to agree that Wayne Brazel had not acted alone. The half-brother of Oliver Lee, Garrett's old nemesis, was heard stating that Deacon Jim Miller was the true assassin. The chief of the New Mexico Mounted Police, Fred Fornoff, was likewise told that Miller was the triggerman and that he had been paid by a local rancher. Could this rancher have been W.W. Cox? After all, not only did Wayne Brazel work for Cox, but the rancher was also connected through marriage to Garrett enemies Oliver Lee and Prent Rode. Speaking of Rode, Pat's daughter Annie received an anonymous letter accusing Prent of being that mystery man that Brazel was seen talking to on the road. What's more, Prent was also seen by others coming and going from the side of the murder. But let's go back to W.W. Cox real quick. What motivation could he have had in orchestrating Garrett's death? Well, it turns out the rancher had loaned Pat at least $3,000 in order to help him pay off some of those creditors. And you know how Garrett was when it came to paying folks back, even his own friends. Pat would just flat out ignore any and all requests for reimbursement. Some think that the money, along with the past shooting there at the Cox Ranch, and all this recent drama over those goats, was enough to sever the relationship between Cox and Garrett for good. Also, per ranch employees, W.W. Cox was deathly afraid of Pat. Starting to sound like a frontier version of that game Clue. Only instead of the butler or the maid, we gotta figure out if it was the dim-witted cowboy, the wealthy rancher, or the notorious assassin, or some weird combination of all three. Needless to say, the authorities had their work cut out for them. But weirdly enough, they did not have the money needed to conduct a proper investigation, or so they said. The Attorney General for the territory of New Mexico even began making the rounds to all of Pat's old friends, hat in hand, attempting to collect donations in order to fund the case. Both Emerson Huff and Jim Powers were approached, but neither were interested in contributing to the cause. I guess Pat had owed both of them money as well, and despite the very real friendship that both men had with Garrett, I reckon they weren't willing to go further in the hole for a dead man. And there was also a little bit of a fear factor. Hoff flat out told the Attorney General, quote, "I know that outfit around the Oregon Mountains, and Garrett got killed trying to find out who killed Fountain, and you will get killed trying to find out who killed Garrett. I would advise you to let it alone," end quote. Now, despite these setbacks, Wayne Brazel would be tried for murder in May of 1909, well over a year after the killing. Any guesses as to who Brazel's defense attorney was? If you just yelled out Albert B. Fall, give yourself a damn pat on the back. In hindsight, I should have turned these last couple episodes into a drinking game. Take a shot every time I mention Fall's name. No, actually, do not do that. That would be horrible for your health. Now, this trial, if you want to call it that, lasted all of one day. And based on what I'm about to tell you, it appears to have either been so badly mishandled that it borders on the criminal, or it was just fixed from the get-go. First of all, the prosecuting attorney was good friends with Albert Fall, make of that what you will, and the only eyewitness, Carl Adamson, wasn't even called on to testify. The doctor who performed that autopsy, the man who determined that Garrett was shot in the back of the head, was cross-examined, but the defense failed to inquire as to the angles of the bullet wounds. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but there were empty rifle casings found about 30 or 40 feet from Pat's body. A lot of people assumed that since the bullet that was dug out from his midsection came from a pistol, that the same type of round was also used on his head, which incidentally went through and was not recovered. It could very well be that Pat was shot in the head with a rifle, followed by somebody else, possibly Wayne Brazel, then plugging him in the gut with a pistol. As far as I could ascertain, none of this was brought up at the trial. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes and returned with the verdict of not guilty. And just to be clear, there was no doubt that Brazel killed Garrett. He admitted to it, but the jury just figured it was done in self-defense. In other words, it was justifiable. Shortly thereafter, a big barbecue was held at the Cox Ranch in celebration, with Wayne Brazel as the guest of honor. Now, I've had a couple of people reach out since I started this series, informing me of the fact that in 2017, a clerk discovered the original 6-man coroner's report over there in Donna Ana County that was filed after Pat's death. And the report does list Wayne Brazel as Garrett's killer. And of course, when this report was found, several news outlets ran stories with headlines suggesting that the mystery was finally, at long last, solved. I'm not so convinced. First of all, this is stuff that was already known for like over 100 years. Wayne Brazel absolutely confessed to killing Pat Garrett. and he was acquitted. And unless I'm missing something here, that coroner's report was filed way before the trial. So while Wayne Brazil is officially listed as Pat Garrett's killer, I'm not disputing that whatsoever. I do think there are enough red flags for us to assume that not all is as it seems, and that maybe, just maybe, Brazil didn't act alone. We also know that despite that acquittal, a lot of the locals there in Donna Ana County suspected that Brazil was simply the fall guy. What's more, there's even stories where he admits as much, saying that he did not kill Pat Garrett. Now, as far as I know, that is anecdotal and not consistent, as Wayne would also make many other statements expressing regret over having killed Pat. Which brings us back to the big question. If Wayne did not kill Garrett, then who did? Well, in the 1950s, historian C.L. Sonneshan supposedly met with Oliver Lee's son, Oliver Jr., who claimed that Print Road was the true killer. Apparently, W.W. Cox did indeed hire Deacon Jim to be the assassin, but Road shot Garrett in the back of the head with a Winchester before Miller could make good on the deal. By the way, apparently Manning Clements was the bag man between Cox and Miller. Now, C.L. Sonneshan is also a big brushy bill proponent, so I do generally dismiss anything he touches, but he wasn't alone here, as it seems Oliver Lee Jr. did share this same version with at least one other person, New Mexico lawyer W.T. Moyers. And like I said, the story they got was that Print Road shot Garrett in the back of the head with a rifle, and that Brazil just went and fired his pistol into Pat's body. As far as Miller's involvement, a deal's a deal though, right? And when you shake hands with the devil, you best be prepared for the hell that follows. Deacon Jim, despite not having completed the job, still felt like he needed to get paid. And there just weren't a whole lot of people willing to tell old Killer Miller to go get fucked. As such, W.W. Cox still had to pony up the money. And he did. Speaking of Cox, his son would also claim that Uncle Print Road was the shooter. Uh-oh. Not so cut and dry anymore, is it? And how the hell do we know who to believe? Let's just keep going, though. Assuming that Cox and Print Road did conspire to have Pat murdered, and that Brazil was just the dumb fall guy, what would their motivation have been? There's no way they murdered a man simply over goats, right? I know Pat and Print Road had their disagreements in the past, but why wait so long to get even? You know, did he really kill Garrett over that leased land, or was that just the tipping point? And there are a lot of people who think that it simply came down to fear. Pat was not much of a, how should I put this? He wasn't a respecter of feelings. Garrett could be rude, and some of his statements to both Print Road and Wayne Brazil may have seemed a little threatening. We also know that he had been acting somewhat erratic in the months preceding his death, walking around with a damn hair trigger and getting into fights. According to Albert Fall, quote, everybody was afraid that Garrett was going to kill someone, and a sigh of relief went up when he was finally killed. So yeah, I guess fear is one motivation, and another could have just been greed. After all, in the end, Bill Cox did end up with the Garrett Ranch. By the way, his spread ended up being freaking huge, although much of it was eventually taken by the U.S. government as part of the White Sands Missile Range. So there you go, greed, fear, retribution. Was it Print Road? Was it W.W. Cox? Was it Deacon Jim Miller? Or was it really Wayne Brazil? And who knows, it could all go back to the Albert Jennings fountain case. Maybe Pat was getting close to solving it. Maybe Cox was involved. Pretty sure Oliver Lee was. And maybe they removed this thread before Pat could come forward with his findings. Now, historian Leon Metz is not quite as suspicious as I am. In his biography, Pat Garrett, The Story of a Western Lawman, Metz writes, quote, writers, historians, and gunfighter buffs almost unanimously agree the conspiracy began at a secret meeting in El Paso's St. Regis Hotel. How all these authorities document their allegations is in itself something of a secret, since many of them cite dead men who meant to talk for the record, but never quite made it, or, quote, printed fictional stories which made many insinuations but offer no proof. Although the names of those attending the meeting vary, depending on whom you read, or whom you choose to believe, those most frequently mentioned have been Oliver Lee, Bill McNew, Jim Miller, Carl Adamson, Manning Clements, Print Road, Wayne Brazil, W.W. Cox, and Albert B. Fall. The subject of this get-together was Pat Garrett and how to get rid of him. Cox supposedly called this group of Garrett haters together and explained the problem and its solution. He despised Garrett because of the Newman killing. He wanted Garrett's land, especially the water, and he feared that Garrett was getting too close to solving the fountain mystery. Cox agreed to pay for the shooting, but insisted that the murder had to appear as self-defense. Most of the discussion revolved around the methods for provoking Garrett, and Lee finally came up with the most acceptable solution. He suggested that Wayne Brazel, an easygoing, good-natured young man who was liked by nearly everyone, lease the unused Bear Canyon Ranch and put goats on it. Most people could be counted on to be sympathetic to Brazel, and if he took the blame for the killing, a jury would most certainly free him. Since Brazel was not a professional gunman and might himself be killed if he tried to shoot Garrett, someone else would have to do the job and guarantee its effectiveness. All eyes turned towards Jim Miller. There it is, the motive, the conspiracy, and the murderer. Enough romance and mystery for a saddlebag full of paperback thrillers. It seems a shame that none of it is true. End quote. Metz then goes on to explain, very convincingly, I might add, that there is no logical reason for all these dramatics if all they wanted was for Jim Miller to assassinate Garrett. I mean, think about it. All Miller really had to do was just hide behind a hill and shoot Pat as he rode by. The author also argues that both of the bullet holes in Pat's body were caused by a .45 Colt as opposed to both a pistol and a rifle, referencing that Winchester shell found near Garrett's body. Now, Metz may be mistaken here. I offer that up very humbly, as I am an idiot and most likely don't know what I'm talking about. But it is my understanding that nobody knows for sure what caliber was used on Garrett's head. I think it's just assumed that it was a .45, as that was the caliber that was pulled out of his torso. I could be wrong, though. It's my opinion that if it was two shooters, Jim Miller or whoever could have initially shot Garrett with a rifle, and then Brazel or even Adamson just shot him again for good measure with a pistol. But I don't know. Furthermore, Metz, when mentioning that Winchester shell, also makes a great point in stating that nobody knows when it was fired. Anyone could have just shot at a deer or even just a target a month prior and left the casing right there on the ground. Metz also points out that Jim Miller preferred to use shotguns during his assassinations, which is also true. Either way, there's no proof that Deacon Jim Miller was there at the scene of the crime. And just in case you've ever heard the rumors about Miller confessing to killing Pat Garrett shortly before he was executed, well, according to the man who actually strung Miller up, that's not true. Per Walter Gain, the jailer who put the noose around Jim's neck, he made no confession whatsoever. I ought to know, said Gain, because I hung him. Metz also discounts the idea that W.W. Cox was involved, speculating that if the rancher really wanted Garrett's property, he could have had it without killing him. I mean, he did hold the damn mortgage on the place. Ultimately, Leon Metz does accept that Wayne Brazel alone was responsible, despite his lack of ever being involved with previous doings. Metz speculates that it was more than likely not premeditated, and that Brazel was genuinely afraid of Garrett. Once Pat began hacking on him, things got tense, and then when Garrett turned his back to take a piss, Wayne went ahead and took the safe way out and put Pat down before he could have a chance to do the same to him. Now, Jarvis Garrett, who was just a baby when Pat was killed, would naturally want to look into the killing as he got older. And Jarvis came to a conclusion far different than that of historian Leon Metz, an angle to the story that I definitely did not see coming. Turns out Carl Adamson, that go-between with Garrett and Wayne Brazel, was not just a casual acquaintance of Mr. Miller from El Paso. Indeed, he and Deacon Jim were in-laws. What's more, not long after Pat's death, Adamson would be sent to prison for illegally smuggling Chinese workers into the United States from Mexico. And by the looks of things, he was not alone in this venture. Remember Manning Clements, cousin of John Wesley Hardin and brother-in-law of Deacon Jim Miller, and friend of W.W. Cox? Well, he would come to a mysterious end himself 10 months to the day after Garrett's murder. Clements was having a drink in El Paso's Coney Island Saloon, the same drinking establishment owned by Pat Garrett's good friend, Tom Powers, when someone walked up behind him and blew his damn head off. And not a single other person in that saloon ever claimed they saw a thing. Nobody. This was at 6:15 in the afternoon, and not only was Texas Ranger Captain John Hughes in attendance, but so was Burt Mossman, one-time head of the Arizona Rangers. As one of their company rose to intervene, either Hughes or Mossman ordered them to sit down, saying, "We don't want to get mixed up in this." Now, it turns out Manning Clements was also involved in that human trafficking. And at least one source I found from author Mark Boardman even describes Tom Powers' saloon as the, quote, headquarters of the Chinese smugglers, end quote. Clements had, believe it or not, been working in law enforcement, but was recently charged with armed robbery, as you can imagine, ending that particular career. He was drinking heavily, and I guess the theory is that his smuggling partners feared he was going to start talking unless they paid him some hush money. And yeah, instead of paying, they simply hushed Clemens for good. The killer? Who knows? But as was the case with Garrett, one prime suspect is Mannon's own brother-in-law, Deacon Jim Miller, who of course would be strung up by vigilantes up there in Oklahoma just a few months later. Now, according to Jarvis Garrett, even as recently as the 1970s, his father Pat was not killed by Killer Miller or Wayne Brazel or any of them others, but instead Carl Adamson, the guy behind this damn smuggling operation. It's my understanding that Jarvis did not expand further, but others have taken this to mean that Adamson and Prent Road and W.W. Cox and all them other cocksuckers who were mixed up with Manning Clements and Deacon Jim wanted to take Garrett's land in order to hide those Chinese immigrants that they were sneaking into the country. I'm not sure how realistic this is. I sort of feel like that area of New Mexico already had a lot of places where you could hide a large group of people. I mean, assuming that W.W. Cox was involved, which I'll admit is an assumption, he did have a lot of property himself, and so did Oliver Lee. It does make me wonder how much Tom Powers knew, though. He was a very good friend of Garrett's at one point. Hell, he even gave the damn eulogy at the funeral. But was he also in cahoots with these smugglers? It kind of sounds like it. Kind of makes me curious as to what he really knew about Pat's death. I'm actually really interested in learning more about this in the future. For what it's worth, Tom would take his own life several years later in 1931 as he was battling cancer. Anyway, Carl Adamson passed away in Roswell in 1919. And as far as I know, he never retracted his statements. Albert Bacon Fall, the attorney who was possibly behind the murder of Albert Jennings Fountain, the guy who successfully defended Oliver Lee and Wayne Brazel, would eventually get involved with a little something known as the Teapot Dome scandal. He did a year in jail, his property was seized, and he died completely broke in El Paso in 1944. Prent Road moved to Arizona after the Garrett murder, and ironically began feuding with his brother-in-law Henry Murphy over a leased land dispute. When Road attempted to evict Murphy, Murphy refused, just like Wayne Brazel, so Prent simply gunned him down. He'd do 2 years in prison and live out the rest of his life in El Paso, dying in 1942 at the age of 73. His full name, by the way, was Archie Prentice Road, which I think might be why he was so damn high-strung all the time. As far as old Wayne Brazel goes, brace yourself. Shit's about to get even weirder. Brazel would get married to a school teacher in September of 1910, and 9 months later, they welcomed a child, Jesse Brazel. Unfortunately, 2 months after Jesse's birth, Wayne's wife died of pneumonia. And 4 years after that, Wayne Brazel pulled an Albert Jennings Fountain and disappeared off the face of the earth. As late as 1935, his son Jesse, who by then was a grown man, hired a private investigator to figure out what the hell happened to his daddy. The detective soon reported back that Brazel had gone down to South America, where he was killed by none other than Butch Cassidy. Okay, so I know there's some debate as far as when Butch died. I do personally believe Cassidy was killed in Bolivia in 1908, but still, could it be that Brazel really was killed in South America just by somebody else? Maybe. Who knows? I found yet another source claiming that Wayne moved to Arizona, where he was also killed. As of this recording, Brazel's fate remains a mystery. Oh, but we're not done. Years later, in 1947, his nephew, William Mack Brazel, would go down in history as being the feller who discovered the Roswell UFO debris on his ranch about 70 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. Which kind of makes me wonder, was Wayne Brazel killed or was he abducted by aliens? What about Albert Jennings Fountain and his son? A lot of disappearances going on in this area. Were they also abducted by aliens? Did Pat Garrett get a little too close to uncovering the truth only to have the aliens kill him? Obviously, there's no way of proving this, but yeah, I do think that's a safe bet. But why stop there? Was Billy the Kid an alien? If so, does this explain his very weird appearance in that famous tintype? Once again, yes. I mean, I can't prove it, but I do think it's very plausible. Think about it. We don't know for sure where Billy was born, right? People think maybe New York, but there's no proof. Nobody knows where the hell this guy was before he came to New Mexico. Maybe that's because he wasn't born here on Earth. You ever think about that? Huh? Maybe that's why they don't want to do a DNA test. What are you trying to hide, New Mexico? Look, I'm not saying that Billy the Kid was an extraterrestrial and that by killing him, Pat Garrett unwittingly opened up an interdimensional wormhole and plunged the world into a cold war with alien life forms, who ultimately would not only abduct Albert Jennings Fountain and Wayne Brazel, but hundreds of others over the past century. But I'm not saying that isn't the case either. You be the judge. Listen, all my bullshit aside, I'm not really sure where I stand on all this. You've heard me say many times in the past that the most simple explanation is oftentimes the one that turns out to be the most true, right? Occam's razor. And when it comes to Pat Garrett's death, the simple explanation is that Wayne Brazel was scared shitless. They were out in the middle of the desert, Pat was leaning on him, so when Wayne got the opportunity, he just put a bullet in the back of Garrett's head. And as Pat was falling or writhing on the ground, he put another in his gut, either just out of nerves or to make sure. He and Adamson stuck to the self-defense story just to make it a little easier for the jury to let Brazel off. Also, y'all know me, I'm kind of big on actual sources. And all the theories I floated earlier about W.W. Cox, Oliver Lee, Deacon Jim Miller, all of that is just anecdotal. As far as I could tell, there's no actual proof that any of them were involved. Is it a little fishy? Yes. Honestly, it's more than a little fishy. Albert Fall had his hands in everything. We know he was crooked as hell. Oliver Lee almost certainly was involved in the death of Albert Jennings Fountain. And they were all intertwined and intermarried with W.W. Cox and his family, who himself was a damn killer with ties to the feuding Taylors in Texas. Then you got Prent Rode and his hatred of Garrett, this weird Chinese smuggling connection, the death of Manning Clements, Tom Powers, Deacon Jim Miller. It's a lot, okay? They say where there's smoke, there's fire. And I'm certainly not opposed to the idea that there was some sort of murder conspiracy. But at the end of the day, all we can go on is what we can prove, right? All the rumors and stories about all these suspects I just mentioned were just that, rumors. At least they were, barring any hard evidence. The official version of Pat's death is also pretty damn plausible. Garrett was desperately in need of money there towards the end and acting like a damn fool. Could he have finally had a break in the Fountain case? Or could he have discovered the smuggling operation? Sure. But it's also pretty likely that Wayne Brazel simply murdered Pat due to fear. Who knows? We may never get the full story, right? And by the way, just because I think Brazel did it doesn't mean I buy his story about self-defense. I don't think Garrett was on the buggy. I don't think he was going for that shotgun. I think the evidence suggests that he was indeed taking a piss and Brazel plugged him from behind. What do you think? Is that really what happened? Did Cox or Oliver Lee or Prent Rode also have a hand in it? What about the aliens? Hit me up, Josh at wildwestextra.com. Let me know what's on your mind. Now, I posed a question at the beginning of this series. Was Pat Garrett a good man or a bad man? And has he been unfairly or falsely maligned? I have thoughts. What else is new, right? But I also think the epilogue in Leon Metz's biography on Pat Garrett sums it up pretty damn good. Mr. Metz writes, quote, Walter Noble Burns, author of the exasperatingly popular Saga of Billy the Kid, is credited, with considerable accuracy, with being the principal force behind the legend surrounding the life, and most particularly the death, of the incorrigible young man whose violent end brought Pat Garrett momentary fame, long-lasting rue, and a dubious distinction that can almost be compared to that of the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid Jesse James in the ground. Perhaps more than any single person, other than the kid himself, Burns, in his romanticized saga, flagrant with error, distortion, and misinterpretation, became Garrett's nemesis. This vastly popular book served to haunt and cast dishonor upon the lawman long after his mutilated corpse was laid to rest in the Las Cruces cemetery. The saga became an overnight bestseller, and since 1926 has gone through many printings. However, unknown to most casual readers with no particular expertise concerning Southwestern history, the book aroused dismay and wrath among Lincoln County historians. Almost to a man, these scholars disputed Burns' contention that Billy the Kid was a knightly hero and that those who opposed him deserved to be sent to the wall. It is therefore ironic, in view of the uproar, that Burns himself took further cognizance of his notes and interviews and, in response to the outcry, wrote a perceptive evaluation of Pat Garrett's accomplishments. Writing outside his usual fictionalized historical style, Burns gave a cogent statement on the subject in 1928 when he wrote to Maurice Garland Fulton, one of the most knowledgeable students of the Lincoln County War and its brutal history. Burns wrote, "I have heard Garrett damned up and down in New Mexico as a coward and a cold-blooded murderer, but Garrett carried out the job he undertook with courage and determination, when we take into consideration all of its difficulties and dangers. In my estimation, Garrett was a brave man. He must have been brave to do what he did. And what he did, it seems to me, resulted in a new era of law and order for Mexico." Reinforcing Burns' unpublished opinions of Garrett's accomplishments was Eugene Man Love Rhodes, kind of an awkward name, who was sympathetic to the Tunstall-McSween Billy the Kid faction, but nevertheless recognized that a brave and honorable Patrick Floyd Garrett had been seriously slandered. Rhodes treated Burns' saga with sarcasm and wrote that with the election of Pat Garrett as sheriff of Lincoln County came the appalling discovery that the new sheriff intended to observe his oath of office. The book was described as no history but fiction, in which Billy the Kid was the hero and Pat Garrett was the heavy. Rhodes said that reading the saga, you will get the impression that Billy got shabby treatment all along the line, that it was inconsiderate of the sheriff to molest him, that it was unsportsmanlike to search for him in his own country, right where he lived, and that it was positively discourteous and unfair that Garrett did not let Billy the Kid kill him in the last. Rhodes furthermore demolished several of the more damaging charges against Garrett by many of the Kid's biographers and idolaters. Rhodes admitted that Garrett killed a former friend, but argued that everyone knew in those days that it was unjust to damn the sheriff just because he did not let a friendship interfere with his duty. With respect to Garrett's bravery, Rhodes said that Pat kept up a daily pursuit of the young outlaw, knowing that there was no rock or ridge or tree, but death might lurk behind it. As for the oft-repeated statement that Garrett unfairly killed the Kid, Rhodes retorted that Billy would have taken the same advantage had the opportunity presented itself. There was only one thing for Garrett to do, and he did it. He shot Billy through the heart. I cannot imagine any man doing otherwise. I cannot imagine any other thing to do. To his great credit, Pat Garrett had no illusions about what others would think of him after his death, nor did he worry or concern himself about his place in history. That evaluation he left to others. Though this question is still being answered, one view that can be given considerable weight is that of Theodore Roosevelt, who, although he failed to renew Garrett's position as El Paso customs collector, followed the former sheriff's career with great interest. Garrett's death saddened him, and he spoke briefly of the matter to Patrick J. Hurley, Secretary of War during Herbert Hoover's administration and later United States Ambassador to China. Hurley recalled this conversation in a letter to Oscar Garrett on December 9, 1950. When your father was killed, President Theodore Roosevelt made a statement to the effect that Pat Garrett was not the man who upheld the arm of law and order in New Mexico. He was the first man to introduce law and order. In my time and years, I hope that we will be able to see that justice is done to the character of the greatest New Mexican, Pat Garrett. End quote, and very well put, Mr. Metz. Now, I don't know if this series has done justice to the character of Pat Garrett, and that's certainly not my intention. I'm not here to prop up or defend any of these people. I think their stories are very interesting. I love talking about the Old West, but first and foremost, I do strive for accuracy, and I at least hope that I've got more right than I've gotten wrong as far as Garrett's life is concerned. Pat Garrett was no coward. I don't think he was a murderer, and he certainly was no more of a liar than anybody else from that era. That said, there can be no doubt that he was also a flawed man. He was delinquent in paying his debts, yet still found time to gamble. He had a wife and kids at home, but he still cavorted about with a mistress, and on and on. But you know how that saying goes about people in glass houses, right? Hell, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty much just one big walking, talking flaw myself. And I guess that's about all I've got on Pat Garrett. Thank you so much for listening.